here, and then we'll give everybody a few minutes before we begin. I had to kind of just do the wet shower look. I apologize, but I ran a little short of time. I had a lot of things to do today, but I got everything done, so it was worth it. And now I'm here. So I'm glad you're here, or if you're able to be here now or later, thank you for joining us. The show we're going to have is very important. And I think whether you're a member of the Watchtower Society or not, the information that we're going to consider will be applicable one way or the other in some part of your life, I believe. So stay tuned, even if it's not something that directly affects you. But I have a suspicion that if you're here, probably you either are directly affected or someone you know is affected. And many of us, of course, either are or have been associated with the Watchtower Society. Some people who have been members of the Watchtower Society have left, and different people have done different things, right? There have been many people who have taken a stand against certain things they disagree with where it concerns the Watchtower Society. There are others who sort of just move on in a different direction in life and kind of lose interest in religion. And then there are some who still believe in the Watchtower Society and in the Bible. When I say believe in the Watchtower Society or a part of the Watchtower Society, I'm not suggesting that members of the Watchtower Society don't believe they 100% follow the Bible. Okay, let's just get that out of the way right now. Now, of course, Trinitarians would say the same thing. So we all know that we still have to subject our beliefs about what we think are the basis for why we believe something, just like the Bible tells us, to make sure of all things. Hold fast to what is fine. So the discussion is obviously going to focus around the Watchtower Society and some key aspects of it that may or may not move a person to believe that it is uniquely qualified to represent God, and in fact does uniquely represent God. We'll look at some of the reasons why people believe that, why I believe that, not quite in the same sense that I think a number of people believe it. I never believed the Watchtower Society was anything more than very, when I say Watchtower Society, at this point I'm referring pretty much exclusively to the governing body, right? There might be other people involved, right? And there are a lot of people who, of course, are involved with what is produced through the publications of the Watchtower Society. But ultimately, as everybody knows, it has to be approved by the governing body. Even if it's something they delegate to somebody else, there's going to be an approval in there somewhere, directly or by delegation. So it's important that we understand what it is that might move people, what has moved people like me in the past to, while not, again, fully accept them as some people do, as some have told me, almost a superhuman group of individuals that absolutely cannot be corrupted. Literally, many Jehovah's Witnesses associated with the Watchtower will tell you, and I have had them tell me, there's no way they could be corrupted. There's no way Jehovah would allow his organization to be corrupted after going through the process of selecting them, which we'll get to later. But for now, my point is, we're going to be looking at some evidence that may or may not justify this acceptance of the Watchtower Society as something other than a group of imperfect, very dedicated individuals who are trying to do the will of God, but who absolutely can be corrupted and so therefore need to be watched and held accountable. That was always my view. Now, I never really, I guess, thought I'd have to reach this point where I would have to hold them accountable, right? I really always, at least in my early days, I was baptized in 1990. And of course, got involved in, I was involved in the organization before then, though, for several years. And I grew up in it and took it very seriously, I would say, in my junior year of high school. So I had many conversations my junior and senior year, and of course with people I knew, and everyone knew me as a Jehovah's Witness. I never saluted the flag, all that stuff, We never did holidays. I never participated in holidays at schools when I was growing up. So my grandparents on my mother's side are the ones who first came in contact with the organization. I still have my grandfather, Stephen Gades, make sure of all things. And I have my grandmother on my mother's side. She was full-blood Norwegian. I have her, what was it, Man's Salvation. I think it was a 1975 book. It's got her name in it, Lily Gade. So, I have things, of course, from my mother. I have her Babylon the Great book all marked up and stuff, So, and I have done things I think unique, of course, to people associated with the Watchtower, right? I'm not the only person who's written books, but I've written some pretty, we'll say, detailed books, extensive, dealing with issues that you don't commonly find dealt with, whether it's the Sharp's Rule issue, whether it's John 1:1, 858, the divine name, right? There's other books. But I think, I'm not trying to put myself in any special light. I'm just, like Paul's saying, I'm trying to explain my history, right? Like when Paul talks about all the things he's gone through and the things he's done and where he's learned. It's not about building himself up in their eyes. It's about helping them understand that what he's about to tell them is coming from a perspective that has this to inform it. So I'm not someone who hasn't really looked at these issues, is what I'm getting at, right? And for the most part, Watchtower people, a positive perspective, right? Even now, even though I clearly disagree with some things having to do with chronology, the blood issue, and the authority of the governing body, it's not like I sit here and hammer away at that all the time. Any of those issues, really, right? I'm not shy about talking about it, and it does come up, and I have a few videos, but other than a couple that I've done just to make it very clear to people where I stand, I just try to focus on the God of the Bible and the Messiah. Wouldn't you agree that's what we focus on here primarily? And other related issues. I mean, again, there's other videos, right? Salvation, 144,000, right? There's all kinds of stuff that we talk about. But what I'm getting at is our focus, I believe, is pretty clearly not the Watchtower, right? And yet we probably could. We probably could just really make 50 or more % of all the content on this channel all just Watchtower. And then I'd probably have a lot more people interested, whether they're Watchtower people or not. But that's not our fault. We're not trying to create a problem, right? I don't think many of us, if you're like me, right? I can't speak for everybody. I can speak for me. I don't like a lot of things that are going on in the Watchtower that they teach, and we'll talk about some of them. But I also recognize things that they have done that are positive and that are actually exceptional. And we'll talk about some. In fact, you could say that today's show, and I just thought of it, it wasn't planned this way, is kind of similar in content. It won't be as extensive. And there's going to actually be a lot different substance. But now that I think about it, it just dawned on me. It's not too far off from my 3 dissertations, in which I talked about the history of the faithful and discreet slave teaching. And I talked about the authority of the great crowd in comparison to the anointed. And then I talked about the chronology, right? It's my second edition of Jehovah's Witnesses Defended. I did an extensive, right? A whole chapter defending the Watchtower against what I to this day still believe, right? Pretty much everything I wrote in that chapter, I stand behind, because the thing with the Watchtower Society is, as I talk about in that very chapter, and as many people also know, they have explicitly denied being inspired prophets. Now, I realize, hang on, I know a lot of anti-Watchtower people are like, whoa, Greg, I know they have also said and depicted themselves, usually in kind of a greater fulfillment way, or an analogous way, you could say, with other prophets, right? Like the Ezekiel class and that. And it comes across as if, yes, they believe they have been directly appointed, and they do believe that, right? So there's definitely an element of spiritual sanctioning that they absolutely accept. But they also, at the same time, while they believe they've been, right, in, they have God's Spirit, they apply all these prophecies having to do with the end times to them, and God pouring out His Spirit, and they see themselves, right, they shall know that a prophet was among them. Now, again, they often put that word in quotes. They often deny being inspired prophets in the same article many times. And that's what makes it so difficult to, at least for me, say, based on some of the things that they have claimed that are not true, that didn't prove to be true, while at the same time saying that they're basically like prophets, That's why I sort of pull back on that, and why, of course, whenever I see other anti-Watchtower writings that do not explain that aspect of it, do not provide the context of quotes that make it seem like they absolutely do claim to be inspired prophets, right? So a big part of the problem with a lot of anti-Watchtower material, or we'll just say, if they don't think they're anti-Watchtower, if they're trying to just deal with it, whatever, I'll call it anti-Watchtower. If it's against the Watchtower and their chronologies or claims, for now we're going to call it anti-Watchtower literature. Right? Some might just be more his discussion, so I don't know that every work would fit quite in that category, but in any case, a lot of it just did not present the quotations from Watchtower literature correctly, didn't do it in many cases in ways that presented the full explanation the Watchtower was giving, sometimes blatantly misquoted the Watchtower or its material, or Russell, right? I'd have to go back and, these are all the types of things you'll see, of course, in my chapter on the Watchtower and false prophecy in the second edition of Jehovah's Witnesses Defended, right? It's a full defense of those issues, Watchtower people. Now, in 3 dissertations, of course, I go into more, I do basically as all the dates I could find, basically. There might be a few more, but I went everything I could find a source for, and going through all the reprints and all the issues I had and all the books. I did a full listing, went through it all. And then I talked about the pros and cons, right? The good and the bad, the things you might look at and say, yeah, that's God's people. And then the things you might look at and say, no, there's no way that's God's people. Because that's kind of what we have, right? We kind of have what we were just talking about relative to the Watchtower and being a prophet. No, they're not an inspired prophet, but they're basically doing all the things and talking about themselves in ways that is not much different, if different at all, from what we see in the biblical prophets. Right? The only difference would be the biblical prophets aren't denying being prophets, right? That's the only difference. That and the Watchtower's prophecies, quote unquote, Watchtower people, have not proven true. That's two differences you're going to see between the Watchtower Society, the governing body will say, right, today, and prophets in the biblical sense. Old Testament or New? Old Testament prophets and New Testament prophets don't deny being prophets. And what they say comes true. The Watchtower Society, governing body, they believe they've been appointed, that they are a unique channel, right? These are their words. Now, Watchtower Society people and everyone else, I have literature here, but I don't want to turn this into a look at this quote and all these underlines and all the high. Let's just talk for now. And then let's get into the Bible and then talk about that. But let's talk a little more first. So I'm going to refer to things. And if you think I'm wrong, if what I say is not correct and you think it's so off, you need to say something, go ahead. I can pull anything out, I can document, or we can look it up. But I'm going to loosely refer to issues and dates that I think, because you'll know what I'm talking about, kind of like I do with the scriptures sometimes. If I think you know what I'm talking about, or it's easy to document and just Google search, then I'm going to refer to it in the way you can do that, okay? I'll be as specific as I can, but I don't want to go point out everything, and I didn't want to just sit here and pull out my second edition or my 3 dissertations and start reading all these sources. No, you can do that on your own. Let's talk. Let's just talk about these issues for a little bit, and then we'll get into some biblical stuff, because I think if we talk about it in a reasonable manner and just try to look at it fairly, if we really want to do what's right, that's the goal. If the goal is to do it right, then we have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. We have to talk about it and discuss it and try to understand, well, what is going on here? Why is this happening, right? Why do we have a group that seems like it possesses unique characteristics, a theology that isn't commonplace and more traditional and really Constantinopolitan, right? The doctrine of Trinity is really just it's part of the cult of Constantine and Council of False Teachers and Liars in Nicaea, right? There may be a few genuine people there trying to do what they thought was right, but they were led by Constantine the idolater and Athanasius the heretic. So it's just been so long ago, right? People don't think of the Trinitarians as Constantinopolians, really, or Athanasians, or well, Trinitarians, right? That's not biblical. It's not anything in the Bible. It's tradition. But that doesn't mean that all you Trinitarians are. I'm not trying to say you're all going to be condemned and are all bad and are all the same. No, I don't believe that. I've said that many times. Because why? Because just like in the days of Jesus, we had the Jews who were representing God and had his temple, and we had many, specifically the religious leaders, right? The ones who should have known better, the ones who would have told you they know better. They didn't know better. They knew the worst. They did the worst. And everybody suffered because of it. But that didn't mean everyone was bad, right? What about the widow with the 2 small coins? What about the disciples? What about the other people that they reached? So we cannot make broad characterizations of whole groups of people, many of whom might not even be concerned about some of the stuff we're talking about, right? Not even in the Watchtower, it's not like while they talk about dates a lot, right? It's hard not to think about it if you're in the Watchtower, but it's not like every Jehovah's Witness is overly thinking about it. Many are, but a lot of them are just nice people. They seemingly, right? None of us are good. None of us are fully perfect. So this is not like they're sinless and, oh, they're so nice, we should be like, no. You can find these kinds of people in pretty much every group, including non-religious groups, okay? There's nice people everywhere. They also have their own problems. They just don't often show us. And that's why they die too. So nobody is to be looked to, no human. This should be obvious, right? And this takes us to another question, of course. But before we get to the issue of trust, after which we'll get to the texts, let me ask you guys this. And by guys, girls, right? This is a general. Let me ask you this. Speaking of the people in these groups that are nice, right? And they're not really getting into all these issues, and the idea that everybody is as culpable or as aware of all these issues is not correct, I think, through biblical texts like the widow and others, and by our own experience, mine for sure. So why, if there are people like that, if there are people in all these groups, right? Watchtower, Catholic groups, evangelicals, Muslims, Jews, whatever group that is a religious group that's semi-mainstream or large enough to have a pretty sizable group, I don't want to put a number on it, but enough to have a social component that's recognizable and that's easily accessible. Why do you think there are a lot of people in these groups who are nice, quote unquote, right? But don't care as much about all this stuff? Doctrine. Maybe they care. I'm not saying they don't care at all, but we clearly can see even in evangelicals, right? Not everybody is involved in apologetics on their side. Not every Catholic is trying to debate Protestants, right? It's hard to say, right? They may just be like the widow with two small coins and only be concerned about doing the best that they can and helping out in the way that they see that appears to be what they're supposed to do. It's just like Romans 2, right? A text where Paul talks about how people who don't know God are a law, and who do the things that God approves are a law to themselves. A law written on their hearts. And they'll be judged, he says, right in that same text, or right after it. They'll be judged by the secret things of their heart, their thoughts, in the day when God judges mankind. So we have a text right there in Romans 2 where we can see that people can be saved and will be saved even though they're not being saved directly through a knowledge and faith in Jesus, because they don't know him, right? They haven't had an opportunity. They weren't reached with the message directly the way many people have been. Or they didn't have the type of faith that foresaw the Messiah, like people like Abraham or even Moses. So does the Watchtower Society believe that text still? I think they do. I don't know everything currently about the Watchtower yet, but I believe the Watchtower teaches that Romans 2 does provide a basis upon which people who were never reached with the message would nonetheless be saved. Right? So outside of those people, I believe it's pretty clear, and anyone is free to correct me if I'm wrong, that the Watchtower Society believes that outside of the Romans 2 group, you have to belong to their organization, right? In order to be saved at Armageddon. Unless you're part of the Romans 2 group of people that would be a lot of themselves. To be saved, you have to be a supporter of the society, the Watchtower Society, to be a true Christian, right? And so that's a significant claim. It's something we need to take a look at if we want to please God, right? Or if we don't think that's right, what is it that's making so many people believe in this? Well, I was just talking about how many people join different groups and they're very nice, but they're not really into technical issues or doctrine. And that could be similar to the widow with two small coins and not be an issue. Or maybe with these larger socially accessible groups, they just value that more than doctrine, than what is the truth, right? Do you think that's correct? Do you think I'm correct in my assessment that many people associated with the Watchtower and other groups are a part of those groups because they like the association, they like the acceptance? And that even if you showed them a text that explicitly said something against what the group they're a part of requires them to believe, do you think the majority of people, after you showed them something that clearly states a contradiction to their group's beliefs, do you think a majority of them would leave the group over what you showed them? Now, some may just think you're wrong. I get it. Let's take an issue that's not really arguable on its face. People can argue its meaning all day long, but in terms of like word for word stuff, do you think a word for word text is enough? Like the text actually says, do this, believe this, don't do this, don't believe this. Do you think a text like that, clear as day, we're going to look at a couple, but okay, whether it's one God the Father or whatever, I'm asking you, based on your experience with people in your group and in other groups, and society as a whole, and examples from the Bible, like the Jews in Jesus' day, do you believe the majority of people in the group, after you show them something that contradicts a required belief of the group, do you think a majority of people in that group, after seeing that, would leave the group? What would they do? Well, I mean, maybe a couple would, right? Maybe some. Depends how large a group, right? Let's just say a group of 1,000 people. And we're going to use rough numbers. We're just kind of speculating, but not in a way that's dangerous, based on your experience and mine and understanding of society and the biblical account, right? So it could be a group larger. So the Jews of Jesus' day would obviously qualify. Watchtower Society would obviously qualify, right? We're trying to get your understanding of how people in larger socially accessible groups, religious groups, doesn't have to be a Christian group, it has to be kind of religious, a group that you would present a belief to, a fact to, about their beliefs. I want to know what you think. You don't have to necessarily put in, I want you to think about this. How many people out of 1,000 do you think, based on your experience and understanding of similar accounts of people in the Bible, How many people would accept a fact that contradicts their beliefs they didn't know about and then stop doing what you just showed them was wrong? Out of 1,000, I'll say 50 to 100. I'm not trying to. This isn't like there's I'm just based on my experience. I feel like, and I'm not saying my gut instinct in this case is what I mean by feeling, not my emotion necessarily. Just my thoughts about what might be close to correct. 5 to 10%, right? Isn't that what that is? So, if that's true, then something else is causing them to do what they're doing, right? If facts and information that's clear and not subject to controversy, what we're talking about, right? A word for word thing. Don't do this, do this. One God the Father, this type of thing. If those things don't matter, if that's not enough to determine what you're going to believe and do, and we're saying that these groups all believe in a source, and this source can be used, and you show them, right, like a text from the Bible, and you say, look, right here, we'll get into some examples, but I want you to think about it first conceptually. Right? So, whatever percentage it is of people that are staying in these groups for reasons other than factual information, there's just something they value more. The group's association, the acceptance by the group, right? Let's all be honest here, right? It's a nice thing when people like you. Why not, right? And when people start to compliment you and show understanding, right? Most of these groups, no matter what, even really like far edge groups beyond like the Watchtower or others, they're usually going to be upfront, kind of nice, right? So there's something very appealing in this. There's something very difficult to 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 reject. It seems to me a lot of people, based on my experience and things I've read in the Bible, value things more than the truth. It seems to me that is the simplest way to understand why it seems like people don't see what we see. We could be blind too, I understand, but what I'm saying is, if we're committed to basically explicit teachings and commands, right, well, there's very little room there to be deceived. Right? You'd have to be taking something hyper literal or something. But in general, if you're following what is written, that's what the pattern is, right? It is written, and that's it. It's just that, unless it had an initial, we're talking a prophecy, and a later fulfillment. But it's either this or that or this, right? So it's not like it's difficult either way. So no matter what we discuss from here, and we're about to now get into the real discussion of issues and texts. Are you ready? Before we do, and it's not going to be a long show after this, but it'll be about the same as to this point or similar. I want you to remember that. I want all of us to remember that. It's really not often about the facts or what is true. Sorry. Sometimes maybe that's even the case for us, right? We get so used to something, or we're blinded by our desire. I don't think that's the case right now, because when I review the things that I'm accepting and requiring others to accept in a Christian sense, one God the Father, Jah, Messiah, sent for Savior, Son of God, Jesus, Golden Rule. When I review those things, it always comes back the same way. Text, 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 next. Right? It's like, that is what it says, what I am supposed to do. It's not like I have to interpret it or really ask a question. It's just more, can I read? Can I listen if someone else reads? It seems pretty straightforward to me. It's not like there's much you can be deceived on there. Now, once you start going beyond things like that, look at it this way. This is very important. This is big, okay? If people will value things other than facts when it comes to the religion that's supposed to be based on facts, why do they make so much about the truth? Why do they seemingly care so much about truth? I think it's because none of us want to think we don't care about facts, right? I mean, it's obvious. We have to remember that too. We're dealing with a complex dynamic here where we have a lot of people, maybe us at one time, maybe us right now. But if, like I just said, you focus on three things and they're very rock solidly based word for word in the text, I think we're okay. When we go outside of that, though, right, once we start going into things like prophecy and that, let me ask you this. This is important. This is what I was going to say a minute ago. If a group will value, if people in a group will value something other than facts, we just kind of hypothetically talked about how probably 95% in my assessment, I would stay in a group for things other than facts. Just association, just acceptance, just familial bonds and other bonds. Maybe I'm off, right? But let's say that's correct. Or let's just cut it in half, okay? Let's make this simple. Let's say 50%. Let's say 500 people would stay if you showed them the facts. 500 people would leave. Okay. Well, let's say those 500 people are in the Watchtower, the ones that stay. It could be any group, but we're talking about the Watchtower, right? So I'm moving into that domain. The 500 people that would stay in the Watchtower who didn't leave because of the fact you showed them would still care and be subject to, and basically forced to tell other people about, prophecy. Right? Things that are not facts, if they haven't happened yet. So, on the one hand, facts don't matter when it comes to showing someone something word for word, which I'm going to do in just a moment. But then the same people that don't want to hear or follow or respond to those kind of facts will absolutely require you or themselves to believe in non-facts, prophecies that haven't been fulfilled. Now, can anybody show me where we are required to believe in someone's interpretation of prophecy in the Bible, in the New Testament? I'm not talking about Jesus, of course, right? I'm not talking about someone who's obviously inspired. I'm talking about a principle, a teaching that says something that the society could apply to itself and say, well, see, you're supposed to follow all of our interpretations, right? The closest thing I can think of is something like in Acts where it talks about handing on the traditions and teachings of the apostles, right? But that's the apostles. That's the people who are inspired in the New Testament and who had the Holy Spirit poured out on them and who are actually doing the things that we accept as inspired text. So yeah, we do hand on their traditions and their teachings. The society doesn't really put it right. Remember how we started out this discussion? And see, this is how it goes. We started out talking about what everybody knows. The society repeatedly denies being a prophet, repeatedly denies being an inspired prophet. And for that reason, it's difficult, if not impossible, to call them a false prophet. I guess you still could in one sense, but in another sense, I'm not so sure. For that very reason, they're openly denying being something that would have to be accepted, in which they almost do, but not quite to the extent that they deny it, right? So there's a little bit of an area there that has to be considered that makes it not as clean of a designation. But I find it fascinating that so many people, regardless of what the numbers really are, and I know it's some, I find it fascinating that anyone would ignore word for word texts that say do or do not do something and then require other people to believe in an interpretation of a prophecy that's not in the text. Example, 1914. Generation. Being appointed. Jesus appointing the early Bible students or the Bible students pre-Jehovah's Witnesses in 1919 to uniquely represent him as his channel on earth. Or again, even the kingdom being established in 1914, right? There's nothing that does that. The Daniel 4 prophecy explicitly refers to the period of time during which King Nebuchadnezzar would be dethroned. It explicitly states that, right? We don't need to read it. I did a whole show. You can read on your own. Believe whatever you want. But there's no prophecy to even interpret. There would have to be something in the Daniel 4 prophecy of 7 times that indicates something outside of Nebuchadnezzar, and it doesn't. Right? Just like with other prophecies in Daniel, they're very explicit. They refer to very explicit and specific things, like the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the walls, the Messiah being cut off. So it's the same with Daniel chapter 4. Now, we all grew up, if you grew up in the society, with the books, right? The Live Forever book and the picture of the crown and the tree stump with the bands of iron and copper and the calculation, right? But what doesn't become clear until later, right? There's no way anybody in any group is going to be able to see all of the details necessary to understand fully what's going on with a lot of these teachings. It takes some time, different amounts of time for different people, like we talked about earlier, depending on your interests. And so they don't tell you that in the Daniel 4 7 times prophecy, there's nothing talks about, right? They really just jumped to Zedekiah and claimed that he was the last king representing Jehovah's authority on earth, when nothing in Daniel 4 says anything about Zedekiah or anybody but Nebuchadnezzar. And I know it's not easy to hear that, Watchtower people. It's a big deal, right? But remember what we just talked about? We just talked about it. We talked about how there would be some people who would stay in whatever group they're a part of, not because of the facts, but because of the other stuff. And so we understand all that. But the fact is, right, what you can actually show if you read Daniel chapter 4 is that the 7 times or 7 years that applied to Nebuchadnezzar. So, there's nothing else that any text in that account or having to do with the 7 times could be used in any way to show it's anything else. It's just invented. That part of it, right? Not all of it, right? We understand once the society, it's kind of like with, it's different, but it's similar to atheists and evolutionists, right? The evolutionists who don't believe in God, they just skip the whole, how did life begin part. They can't show it, even though we can, right? It happens every day all over the place. Yet they're still looking for where life came from. It came from life, and life's eternal and intelligent, therefore God. They don't believe that, so here we are. But so they skip that part, right? They just believe in abiogenesis or maybe eternal life that's unintelligent. And then, of course, if they believe that, they can't then argue against God being eternal. But usually they just claim that abiogenesis, life from non-life, is what must have happened. No evidence at all, right? All the evidence contradicts it. With the 7 times prophecy in 1914, it's very similar. Right? You kind of have to just not think about Daniel 4. And if you don't do that, it's not that hard to believe. It actually kind of makes a little sense. I mean, even if, forget the whole history with the 0 year and that's not really that big of a deal when you break it down. It's more, if the Daniel 4 prophecy really did kind of say, 7 times will pass over you, Nebuchadnezzar, and from the time of the removal of my last king until the coming of the king, whatever, right? However that could be prophesied, and give the starting point for the 7 times to go beyond, or not just beyond Nebuchadnezzar, right? Because there's a lot of problems, Watchtower people, with the Daniel 4 and 7 times. The main one is, of course, it explicitly refers only to Nebuchadnezzar, nothing else, not even hinted at, not even contextually applicable in any other way. It explains itself, literally. The other problem, though, is even if it somehow, in applying to Nebuchadnezzar, could apply beyond himself, you're choosing the starting point out of nowhere, right? I guess because of the Luke prophecy about the Luke description of the times of the Gentiles. But that doesn't explicitly refer in any way to Daniel 4 7 times. Even if you wanted to apply that as a starting point to Zedekiah in 607, there's nothing that applies that to the 7 times to get 2,520 years, right? It would just then apply to the destruction of the temple, because that's what that prophecy referred to. So, in any case, we talked about that. I did a whole show on the appointed times of the nations. Take a look at it. You can see, I think it's pretty clear that contextually what Jesus is talking about there does not apply to a period of time involving 2,520 years from Zedekiah to 1914. Even if it applies from the time of Zedekiah, a vassal king, right, that didn't really represent Jehovah, but fine. Even if you wanted to do that, it would only go to the destruction of the temple, probably at most. There's no 2,520 years to apply beyond Nebuchadnezzar, and it's not 2,520 years because it specifically refers to a period of 7 years that would pass over him until he knew who the Most High ruling in the heavens was. That's it. That's the extent of that prophecy. We don't have to get into the Gentile times and all the tablets and chronology and king's lists and all that stuff. There's no starting point. Just like with the atheists, they don't have a starting point. They can't even accept the mass amount of evidence all around us every day and all throughout history that proves life comes from life and therefore life must be eternal. And even if you think it's unintelligent eternal life, that's the source of life, based on all evidence, with no evidence to the contrary. That's effectively what you're doing, Watchtower people. And that's a hard one. Once you're aware of that, right? It's not something you're aware of right away. It takes a while even, right? And depending on how interested you are while you're learning about it. For different people, it's different time. Different issues are more important. Once you realize that, though, once it's more than just the depiction and the calculation and Live Forever or whatever other book, why would you believe it? There's really no reason to believe it. Not according to the Bible. You could still believe it, I guess, as something that just you think the Watchtower is correct on, but why? The 7 times is it. That's all. I understand they also apply things like World War I, which isn't really what Jesus is talking about when he says, you'll hear of wars and reports of wars. See that you're not terrified. These things must take place. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Wars and reports of wars. It's been happening. There have been wars all over the place and all over the known world for a long time. No, of course, World War I was different than all that preceded it, just like wars tend to be as time advances. Very significant. We get it. That was not the sign. He didn't say there would be a great war involving all nations. That's much different than wars and reports of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. These things would be happening, he said. Don't be terrified. Don't worry about it. It doesn't sound like something too unusual. It sounds like things that will be happening and that have been happening and that we should expect to happen until the end comes. So what are we supposed to tell people, Watchtower, as far as 1914? You've been teaching about 1914 for a long time. You've taught different things about it, but let's just move past all that, right? We don't need to get into all that stuff. Let's just focus on the key issue, right? You still believe 1914 is when 2,520 years prophesied in relation to Daniel 4 7 times expired, and Jesus took his throne invisibly in the heavens, began inspecting his people as a refiner, sat as a refiner, refined his people, and chose the early Bible students who were not believing. They weren't Jehovah's Witnesses there. Now, maybe you could probably, I don't think that's that significant. I think you could say, well, he knew they would be, right? He picked the ones he knew would be. So I think when the anti-Watchtower people say, well, you believed all these incorrect things, I don't think that's really a great argument. We should look at it, though, right? It's a pretty significant claim. And if almost everything they believed at that time has changed in terms of prophecy and understanding, well, it shows that you could be wrong on a lot of things, right? So think about it this way. Look at the great crowd in the 144,000. Let's move away from 1914 for a moment before we get into the biblical texts. I believe it's still taught in the Watchtower today that only 144,000 will be ruling with Christ in heaven, right? A literal number. And that number had people that was chosen for it in the first century, but that the apostasy happened. And then after 1919, maybe even a little before that, people were chosen again, anointed to fill the 144,000, right? And that's still happening today, right? There's still several thousand, 5 to 10,000, I believe, maybe a few more or less more, who claim to be anointed, who go to the meetings, who partake of the emblems, right? They're viewed as anointed. That would have to mean that at this point, right now, today, there has not been 144,000 anointed people among Jehovah's Witnesses. If we're still going through that process today, and that's why Armageddon hasn't come, because the final number hasn't been sealed, Revelation 6:11, then that means there's clearly been more than 144,000 since the days of Russell, right? And when you combine the New Testament period, and maybe any individuals along the way that the Watchtower would say represented anointed, you would have to say there has not been 144,000 anointed Jehovah's Witnesses or Bible students in about 150 years. That means there have been a lot of false anointed people partaking in your congregations. There would have to be, right? Because if you're anointed, if you're partaking of the emblems, that's it. You're done, and when you die faithful, you're sealed and delivered. If you're not, and far more than 144,000 since the days of Russell and the early Bible students until now have partaken among Jehovah's Witnesses, that's a lot of false anointed people. So, how do we know there are not also today? If all this time has passed and Watchtower and Bible students haven't produced not even 144,000 anointed people out of the millions that have been a part of these groups, well, what does that say? What's going on? Are all of these people liars? They'd have to be, right? Or deceived. Because if you're partaking unworthily, you're not in a good spot. You're not in a good spot, are you? But Watchtower people, that doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense how you couldn't have gotten 144,000 sealed and delivered by now. Out of all these millions of people that are part of God's organization, your God's organization, specially chosen by Jesus Christ himself since 1919, basically. And of course, we can include Russell and some of the early Bible students, I believe, as well. Since that time, and over 100 years, we'll say, since 1919, right? Over 100 years, the millions of people that have been a part of your organization, you have not produced 144,000 anointed people. That is a lot of false anointed Christians. That is really weird and does not make sense to me. Something's not right there. Either you are filled with very few anointed and a lot of false anointed, or you're just wrong, right? Or you guys are not what you think you are. They can't be all true. And if you haven't produced 100, if we're still here, that means at least since 1919. And we could go back as far as, again, Russell's days, in the 1870s, 1880s, depending on where you want to go, right? Where did he start being used, in your opinion? All that time till now, over 100 years, you have not produced 144,000, and it would be less, right? Because there were thousands of anointed people in the first century, probably tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000. I mean, let's just go with thousands, okay? So Watchtower Society and supporting members, you want us to believe that there has not been, we'll say, right, probably more like 100,000 Watchtower. You probably only really needed to come up with 100,000 anointed to end this. And it hasn't happened? Well, who is everybody else? If they're not real anointed, and let's just say they're not fake anointed, even though millions would have had to have been for a long time, and maybe even still now, not millions right now, but a good percentage of those thousands would have to be, right? Because they're still not happening. But once the great crowd started to become the majority, then I think that the numbers get a little diluted with the great crowd being involved. But that's just it, isn't it? The great crowd is not supposed to be involved right now. The great crowd doesn't exist yet. And I'm not laughing, or some of this is hard to deal with at this time, because I'm more aware of the clear, in my view, problems. And so now I see it more clearly, and so I'm less... I have to, though, not let that out, because I realize that other people may still not see it the way I've come to see it. And so remember, non-Watchtower supporters and others who love God, Christ, but don't believe the Watchtower, it's not that easy when you're in it, and we need to understand that. Remember what I talked about earlier. We have a good percentage of people who don't even care about the facts. What I just said and the facts I gave about the 144,000, who cares? I have association. I have friends. My family is here. And as we're going to see in a minute, Jesus specifically spoke to that issue. But don't think for a minute that just by showing people facts or by saying what I just said is going to all of a sudden transform someone, right? We have a problem, though. There's definitely been far more than the number that would be needed to bring an end to this system among those in Jehovah's Witnesses claiming to be anointed for well over 100 years. So a lot of them would have to be liars. And Watchtower people may say, yeah, some of them were just lying. Yeah, okay. But not, were all of them lying? All of the ones who aren't anointed that pretended to be anointed were lying or deceived? And you had that many liars and deceived people in your group acting like Christians? Maybe that's just how it is, right? And we have to deal with it. But then how would you know? How would you know now? Well, there are some signs, there's some fruits, some indications, right? That even you point to when you're talking about the governing body and the Watchtower. Love you have among yourselves. We're going to talk about it. But when it comes to this issue, I'm not really understanding how we could still be here, quite honestly. If God's kingdom was born in 1914 And he was using people like Russell up until that point, and then after that specifically chose the early Bible students who became Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't understand what we're doing here. I don't see how that many chosen people who are among God's people, you're God's people, right? I mean, so does that mean anything? I guess not, right? I mean, if you're God's people and you've been here for over 100 years and you really only needed to fill about 100,000 vacancies, and you've had probably collectively over 100 million members at least, it doesn't add up, right? It doesn't speak well of the anointing process being completed through your organization. All right, and then we have all these other people who aren't anointed and who aren't fake anointed, but you're great crowd, right? You're the great crowd, but you're not the great crowd because the great tribulation hasn't happened yet. What? What are you talking about? If the great tribulation hasn't happened, then you're not the great crowd. Maybe if it happens tomorrow and you go through it, right, then you'd be a member of the great crowd. But you're not right now. And you haven't been for almost 100 years since this whole separation started to take place among Christians in the Watchtower. And as you know, I believe the great crowd are people of the nations. Christ's brothers are Christians. And depending on how the people of the nations treat the Christians, they're the great crowd. The nations. We've talked about it. But you've been saying you're the great crowd for almost 100 years, right? That's like saying, Watchtower people, you're basically saying the tribulation has happened, right? Right? I mean, it's like they're so tuned in with the end being right here. It's like right on, it's like the last day of the last day of the last days, right? So they've got you thinking, and they do, right? Let's just be honest here. You're not the great crowd, but you think you are. Again, it's like I'm a prophet. I'm not a prophet. Fine. Well, then you're nothing. You're neither one. So why are we listening to you? Oh, you have facts and information? Okay. If not, right? If you're telling us something we have to believe, and you don't have really good evidence, right? Like word for word level stuff, if it's required. And if you don't, what you do have is what? It's a prophecy about an ancient Babylonian king that explicitly refers to a period of 7 years where he'd be dethroned until he understood how arrogant he was in comparison to the Most High. What does that do? How do we get, what is it, what in that account applies to anything else? So, we don't have anything explicit about 1914. Which, without that, there's no appointment in 1919. Okay? And this great crowd you guys all claim to be, the non-anointed, you're not even that either. So what are you? Really? What are you? I don't even know what I was. I thought I was the great crowd, right? Or I thought I would be. I just thought we were all in the right. Because remember, when I was coming into the Watchtower in the late 80s, early 90s, everyone was still pretty confident, right? Outside of the people that knew that Daniel 4's 7 times really only applied to Nebuchadnezzar. Not all of us really were thinking about that. Most of us were really tied up in the Trinity, New World Translation stuff, false prophecy stuff, and so these issues came up. But a lot of us didn't really care. We thought, we're so unique in terms of having all these other things that we're going to talk about in a minute. And there's no one else doing this stuff. So this just fits in with that. But once you get deeper into it, then yeah, things stand out. But once you realize, you don't have anything in the Bible you can point to for 1914. There's nothing in the Bible you can point to for 1919. That the Bible actually very clearly speaks of Jesus ruling as king in the first century. Revelation 1:5 calls Jesus the ruler of the kings of the earth. In Revelation chapter 3, he says he sat down on his Father's throne. He conquered, was raised to the right hand of God, and then sat down on his Father's throne and began ruling as king, Watchtower people, in the first century. He says that explicitly. So, we don't have anything taking us to 1914. We don't have anything taking us to 1919. We have nothing that would prove or show you're the great crowd. And now we're facing this question: are you God's people? And I think even in spite of some of the things we just talked about, you still have some qualities that make you stand out among religious groups and that should be considered. But that even when considered and taken collectively are no more different, really, than the same things that marked the Jews as God's people in the first century, the majority of whom were rejected because they didn't accept what was true. So just because you're God, even if, in spite of not having anything explicit about 1914, even if, in spite of not having anything explicit about 1919, or knowing why you call yourselves the great crowd in the majority, non-anointed, even when you consider those things, we still have to ask the question, what is it that we're going to use to identify people as chosen by God in some way or not, right? We could argue maybe on behalf of the Watchtower that nobody's perfect. People make mistakes, right? Maybe the Watchtower is incorrect about 1914 and 1919 in the great crowd. Is that enough to disqualify them? What do you think? Is that significant enough? If the Watchtower is wrong, like ultimately, finality, right? About 1914, 1919, the whole appointment, all that stuff. If they're wrong about all of that, is that enough? Would that mean they're not God's people? What would make you God's people or not, I guess, right? What is it? What are we going to use? How can we decide this question? Well, let's take a look at some text, right? Let's go ahead and bring up some text that I brought together that we'll read together that I think you look at in their context. They give us a pretty solid basis upon which we can say, hey, we're going to do this. We're not going to do that. Because at this point, right, we're facing this question with the Watchtower, and we're trying to answer whether a group that has made some significant claims without any explicit evidence and that want us to completely trust them, right? I've done a video, and many of us are familiar with governing body member Garrett Loesch. I'm not going to play it right now, right? I don't want to trigger Watchtower people or anything, but you know about it, Watchtower people. where he says, God and Jesus completely trust the faithful slave or the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. So why wouldn't you, basically, right? Don't you trust me? I hope so. God and Jesus trust the faithful slave. To me, that kind of claim, completely trusting someone about, and we're not talking about like, a father telling a son who he's trying to like help up a cliff, hey, trust me, I got you. Right? Maybe in that situation, you completely trust someone, right? Or even an emergency worker, like a fireman. You're on the second story of a building, and he's like, go ahead and jump. We got you. Might not be easy, but okay, right? If they got a little parachute or a little balloon down there, whatever it is. Okay, I'll completely trust you. But completely trusting someone when it comes to things that aren't explicit, right? Right. If someone says, "Hey, trust me," trust me when it comes to what the Bible teaches. It says right here, one God the Father. Oh, okay. Basically, we're trusting that they're reading it correctly, basically, right? because if it wasn't explicit, would we trust them? If it says "do not murder," and someone says, "Hey, completely trust me on this. The Bible teaches do not murder," and then we can read "do not murder." Well, that's different, right? That's like someone telling you they know the Bible, so they're going to show you why what they're telling you should be trusted. Okay, so I'm not talking about that kind of thing. But what the Watchtower Society wants people to do, and we all know this is true, right, Watchtower people? I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong and you can document it, right? If you're just going to say something and it's not true, well, then I'll document you. But I'm pretty sure if we don't believe everything the Watchtower teaches, if we don't follow and support the society, right? Christ brothers, Watchtower people, you believe that the prophecy where Jesus will arrive in his Father's glory and sit on his throne in judgment, right? It's a judgment throne. Even the Watchtower Society teaches that, right? That it's a different enthronement than the throne, his Father's throne that he's sitting on. So he's sitting on his throne. He's the ruler of the kings of the earth, but he's going to arrive and sit on the throne of judgment, according to Matthew 25. Separate the sheep and the goats. And how they treated the Christians, right? That's the basis for whether or not they're approved. And of course, they say they don't even know what he's talking about, right? Which in and of itself, I think is something you need to think about, Watchtower supporters. But the Watchtower Society uses that text to basically say, if you don't support us, you're right, you're done. You're going to get cut off. So it's significant when we reach a point where we have individuals who are telling us if we don't support them, we're going to die or be rejected by God and Jesus. They would have to be significant individuals, would they not? Even then, I don't think anyone like Paul or Peter, maybe Jesus, right? But even he, right? He was like totally relying on the Father. He's like, look, I do everything the Father does. So outside of that, I don't think anybody in the Bible would tell you to completely trust them. Can you name one? Can anybody name anybody in the Bible that tells you to completely trust them other than Jesus? if you can do that. But that would be okay. I don't think you can. In fact, you can find just the opposite, right? You can find Jesus in Revelation chapter 2 commending his followers. Let's take a brief look at it. We'll just bring that up. And then we'll get right to our texts. But I think we need to see some of this stuff. Let me make sure I get that on the screen for you guys all completely there. Let's see. Might have to rearrange that a little. There we go. So we all know this text, right? There's not a text anywhere that tells you to completely trust any humans. In fact, you have texts like, before we get to Revelation, right? You could look at this text in Galatians, text we're all familiar with, where Paul, someone to whom Jesus directly appeared and who had authority, he says, even if we, us, like me, Paul, Peter, John, James, Jude, any of us, if we or an angel out of heaven declares as good news something beyond what we declared, let him be accursed. And he goes on to repeat it right here. And then in verse 10, look, he says, is it in fact men I'm now trying to persuade? Or God? Who do I really care about here? Who am I trying to get to approve me? Men, women, or God? You can't do both. You will not do both. Nobody can do both. The Son of God could not do both. I cannot do both. You will not be able to do both. You will only be able to do one. You can please humans, or you can please God. There's some overlap, of course. Ultimately, it will not be the same. How can it? Humans don't say everything according to God's ways. And that's the whole point, isn't it, everyone? That's the whole point. You can't completely trust humans. It says so right here. Does it say the words completely trust? No. But what does it say? If we, the inspired apostles, or an angel, tell you something other than what you already know as good news, you're not to trust it. You're not to believe it. No, you don't trust. No, it came from us and it's different. No, and no. No times no is no. I'm pretty sure. Oh, someone's telling you something? No. An angel came? No. No, and no. The answer is always no. It will always be no. It must always be no. And if anyone tells you anything but no, you got to go. You got to immediately assume the sprinting position. Leave everything where it is and go. Run. He's telling you right here. Now, I'm not saying that's the Watchtower. I'm telling you, if someone, any of these apostles or an angel, tells you something different, you do not completely trust them. Is that not clear? Well, if that's the case, then why is Garrett Loesch telling you to completely trust them about anything? Why wouldn't he say, look, as long as what we tell you agrees with what we're reading in these texts, trust us. Right? That's like what I was saying earlier about instances where someone will tell you, hey, trust me. It very clearly says this. And then they show you. Anything outside of that is no. It's always no. It's never yes. It's never maybe. It's always 100% of the time. You're telling me something different than what I can explicitly find, and you don't have anything explicit to support what you're saying? No. No. Are you sure? No. Did you hear what I said? I said no. You got to go. If you don't go, then you'll just have to stand there while I keep telling you no. And then I'll go. And you can stand there. But I'll stop saying no. Whatever it takes. There is no exception. There will never be an exception. There never has been an exception. No. No. And no. You will never, ever, ever accept something different than what these texts teach you. There is no exception. There is no circumstance. There's nothing. Nothing will change how you understand the good news. Now, some Watchtower people may say, well, Greg, this is now the time of the fulfillment of these prophecies, and so it's okay to talk about more stuff. No. No, it isn't. Not only are your prophecies and your interpretations of them wrong because you don't have any evidence, and so what would I entertain an atheist view of abiogenesis? Why? There's no evidence, and all the evidence contradicts it. Just like your view of 1914, 1919, and the Great Crowd. You want me to call most of your members the Great Crowd when we all agree it's not here yet? How about no? How about I say no and you stop doing that? Because it's gaslighting. Gaslighting is when you tell someone something that's not true and that person has every reason to believe it is true. But you telling them it's not true makes them think it's not true. Kind of like Satan in the Garden of Eden. Although she could have just said, well, look, what you're telling me sounds very interesting. I'd like to do that, but I've been told no. So let's go have a talk with my husband and our God. You seem like a nice reptile, and we've been meeting a lot of the animals here. And so, if I can eat that fruit, then yeah, I want to do that. But I don't know. So right now, no, but let's talk about it and go see our God and my husband. Do you think Satan would have went with Eve to have a chat with Adam and Jehovah? Yahweh? No. The serpent would have said, have a nice day, Eve. It was a pleasure meeting you, and I'll just stay out of this part of the garden maybe for now. Something like that. Yeah, I think it would have probably happened like that. You can always just say no. You can always say, you know what, let's go talk about that with someone who I know. Now, why would anyone not, if Satan won't go with Eve and talk about it, wouldn't that be an indication that Satan is lying? Right? If Satan's telling her the truth and she's really being deprived, wouldn't Satan want to go with Eve and stand up for her and say, hey, God and Adam, I just told her you guys won't let her eat? What's going on here? Don't you want her to be like you? Like us? I want to. No, he probably wouldn't have done that. Or he would have just shown up at whatever point they were there when he made them and laid that command upon them. Either way, my point is, we don't have to listen to people. No, we do not. We can just tell them, man, that's interesting. I'll find out more about that. Why don't you come with me and let's look at it? And if they won't look at the facts with you, if they don't even want to hear it, then the answer is no. That's not how we are. We don't avoid information. We may not agree with everything, but when it comes to the truth, right? Are we Christian? What are we? Again, it goes back to this question about it. Can we even say what the Watchtower Society members are at this point? Well, they're not the great crowd. That's a fact. So we don't know who this large number of people are. They're not anointed. They openly reject being anointed and deny the body and blood of the Christ. Now, they may not see it in a bad way. They may think they're showing honor. No, you're just not partaking of what you're supposed to be partaking of to show that you're a member of the body of Christ and that you're prepared to devote your body and blood like the Christ. That's it. And then you start teaching the truth. You start by telling people that you're not the great crowd. That's number one. That you're just Christians. That you follow the Christ by doing the will of his Father. And that you look forward to a new heavens and a new earth. All of that's biblical. You know what else is biblical? In addition to these texts right here in Galatians 1, clearly showing we're not to completely trust humans or angels. Revelation chapter 2, right? I mentioned it a moment ago. I was just there. We jumped to Galatians real quick. Right? Real clear stuff here, everybody. There's no governing body anywhere in Revelation. Yes, there are accounts in the book of Acts where a group of well-known, prominent individuals were looked to help decide issues that were affecting the community, and that's a good thing. And then when Paul went back there with others, he didn't find them to be the same. And he ultimately rejected them. And he ended up having to confront Peter and Barnabas and others. All of that is in the written records. All of that is what you accept as doctrine. Just like this part right here, where Jesus talks to his followers. He doesn't talk through a governing body. Even here, right? And there would have to be, according to you, a governing body here. You believe there was in Jerusalem in the book of Acts, so it would have been here too. This isn't the apostasy. There were people who were falling away, but that was true in the book of Acts too. All throughout the New Testament period. So, there's nothing here that would indicate in any of these texts a group of individuals who would decide what's next. You know what we do find? We find this right here. Jesus talking to those in Ephesus saying, I know your deeds, your labor, your endurance, that you cannot bear bad men, and you put to the test. How can you completely trust someone if they're supposed to put them to the test? This is antithetical to anyone's claim to be completely trusted. It's not possible, everyone. I'm sorry. You can argue Galatians 1 and say, well, it's not different good news. Okay, fine. How can you argue not even being put to the test? It's right here. It states explicitly that this is something the master approves. And if we put you to the test and we find out you're telling the truth, wonderful, awesome. We'll give you support. If you're not, no support. No support for you. Henry, thank you very much. Appreciate that. I want to acknowledge the super chat right there from Henry. Let me see if I can make this a little bit different here. I'm going to try to, I guess that extends it that way, huh? I'll try to make this a little bit better. That's probably a little bit better, and then I'll move this over here. That way I can check the super chat. Thanks again to Henry there. All right, well, I guess that's probably as good as we're going to make it. So, right here, clearly we have support. Explicit, everybody. If we can't do this, we have a problem. Okay? We can't go further. If we can't put you to the test, we're done. It's over. You failed the most basic test, that is to be put to the test in the Bible. You make claims just like these people did. They said they were apostles. The governing body says they're basically apostles. They're sent forth. Here I am, send me. They were chosen. They're the ones that God, through Jesus, chose and sent forth to declare the good news. Whether you want to argue the technical meaning of apostle or not, there's not much difference there. Apostles are ones sent forth to represent the other, the master. And clearly that's what they claim to be. Well, so these apostles could be tested, but not the Watchtower? What? What are you talking about? Why? Who does that benefit? Why would anybody agree to that? Unless you don't care about the facts. Remember, we talked about that. That would be a reason. If you value your social connections, your family connections, absolutely. This basically means nothing. Who cares, right? Where are my friends? Where's my family? Okay, well, that's your reward, everybody. No matter what group you belong to. That's what you chose, and that's your reward. Why would you think God would owe you more when you didn't choose him or his son and his teachings, and he let you choose what you wanted? What's not true, but what feels good to you. Watchtower people, you say this all the time about Catholics and other groups. No, they're just born that way. They're just raised that way. They don't really believe it. Well, a lot of that's true for a lot of you too. I've met a lot of you. And a lot of you clearly don't care about facts. You don't want to hear it. A lot of you do. And again, there are some reasons to believe that you might just be God's people. Let's take a look at some of those. So let's go ahead and bring up some of our texts that we're going to read together here. That's pretty good. Let's see if we can get... let's see where we are. Okay. I want to try to get all this in here. Is that going to work? So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and... I'm going to pull myself over a little. And then we should have enough room. Very close. There. Let's take a look at a few texts. Watchtower show texts, right? So Watchtower show, are they God's people? Are they false prophets, false teachers? Well, they deny being prophets openly, so that's hard to pin on them, as we've talked about. False teachers, well, we know they've taught things that are false. That's a fact, right? Now, Watchtower people will say that's old light. Light for the righteous becomes brighter and brighter. But the problem, Watchtower people, is light is never false. Right? There's no such thing as old light. If it's light, it's true. Old light is a really good label for false teaching. Now you could say, well, it's just what we got wrong. We didn't mean, we thought we were right. Well, okay, fine. You didn't have to be, doesn't have to be like you intentionally were teaching false doctrine. You just taught what was not true. Okay, does that sound better? Old light, though, is not really correct. Right? It's contradictory. Light is illuminate. It's what's true. That's light. Old light is just like, so what? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's old light, right? That's like one of the oldest truths there is. That's the only way that old light makes any sense. That it's just older. It's been around longer. But it's still true. When you guys say old light, You mean what's no longer true. So that in no way is ever light. It never was light. So where did it come from? If the light that is in you is really darkness, oh no. How great is that darkness, right? No, I don't want to go there. And I didn't really mean to apply that in that way, although it did come to my mind, right? If the light that is, think about that, right? If what you're saying is old light is just really false teaching, whether it was intent really sinister or not, that's not the issue. It was never light. But when they call it old light, it's easier to say that was from God. Because it's light. Light's from God. It's just old light. But it's not old light. It's false teaching. It wasn't from God. It couldn't have been from God. God doesn't give you false teachings or lies. We just come up with them on our own. That's all they are. That's the only way they can happen. God doesn't give us false teachings. We come up with them. We misunderstand things. We get it wrong. It's never God. How dare we ever consider blaming God? But that's effectively what this society makes us do or wants people to do because they don't accept the full blame. It's old light, don't you see? It's truth that they got from God at one time that they no longer believe. But it's not. It can't be truth they got from God because it contradicts what they now claim to get from God. Though it was never true. It's either true or it's not true. You can get something wrong and get something right, but it was always right, right? So that it doesn't make any sense. And the way it's presented is deceptive. It's misleading. It basically attributes error to God by calling it light. You shouldn't do that. Not old stuff. You should just say you got it wrong. You were wrong. You misunderstood it. You're going to be more careful next time. Why can't you guys do that? Because when you make these claims simultaneous with those types of teachings that you get wrong, when you make the claims that you're so special, that you're appointed by God, that you've been chosen to represent him as among all the groups of people on the earth, when you make those kinds of claims and you get this many teachings wrong, you have to say something, right? You have to stop it, first of all. Stop making so many mistakes, okay? Just cut it out. Just give up the prophecy stuff. You guys blew it. You had it. If you would have just stopped right after 1975 even, that's too far, but and I think even before then you guys did some things, great crowd, whatever. But 1975, it should have been the last straw for you guys. But you hung on to this generation thing. And that's what I was talking about early on, and we kind of got sidetracked how, you know, in the 90s and even late 80s and into the early 2000s even, everyone still kind of thought, you know, the generation is still here. And so unless you really understood that the Daniel 4 times just doesn't come into play in the 1914 thing, outside of that, right, it kind of looks right. And then you start thinking, okay, well, if that happened in 1914, and Jesus said this generation will by no means pass, we're like in that generation, the way it was understood, right? So it was pretty easy actually to go along with this belief because it hadn't been contradicted yet. In fact, even though it hasn't officially been contradicted chronologically yet, they've contradicted it, right? I saw some comments in the chat earlier about the overlapping generation and how they now teach that basically if someone was alive and knew someone who was alive and saw the events of 1914, then the generation continues from that person's association with someone who saw the events that they didn't see. Even though Jesus, or the Awake magazine, not only does Jesus say this generation will by no means pass away, referring to nothing else, right? It would only have to be, there's only a way to understand that is that generation. But of course, that's assuming that the generation connects to 1914. But generation of the Bible doesn't, there's no overlapping understanding, right? A generation is never understood that way, that they were the generation just because they knew someone who was in that generation, but that didn't see the things that are spoken of as having been seen by that generation, in this case 1914, right? And the Awake magazine, for a long time, Watchtower people, and we all know this is true, right? It's not hard to show. I mean, it said right there on the first front pages, or I forget which page it was on, but it basically said the Creator's promise is that the generation that saw the events of 1914 would not pass away until God's kingdom comes. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that was essentially what it said. It basically, for decades, promised, and even one issue of the Watchtower in the 80s, I have a copy, several copies of the original and the copy they changed. It was a copy in the 80s, I think 1980, maybe even January 1st. Many of you probably know what I'm talking about. It's the issue where they said that the end of the system basically would come before the end of this century. And then they changed it in the reprint volume, the bound volume, to something different, not as specific. But the Awake magazine would say the Creator's promise that the generation that saw the events of 1914 would not pass away. Right? So why didn't they just say, well, this magazine talks about reasons why we believe that the Creator's promise of a new heavens and new earth will come in this generation. That's still, I think, going a little extreme, but they're qualifying it much more, right? They're not blaming the Creator. The Creator has promised. No, you're interpreting texts in the Bible and saying that's what you believe. But that's not how they presented it. Very indiscreet, I might add, right? It's just kind of reckless that you would claim that it's God's promise. Right? It's like keeping people in this constant state of urgency. And we're not supposed to be like that. We're supposed to be always alert, but peaceful and at ease, so that the God of comfort can be with us. Right? Not always stressed out and wondering, what should we take a class, or should I take this job? Or Armageddon's going to come any day. I mean, we're not supposed to be thinking like that. In fact, as we're going to read, it says explicitly in the Bible, we're not even supposed to be writing about those things. We're not supposed to be even talking about that stuff, because we know that the Lord's day will come as a thief in the night. And in fact, we got some serious warnings about people who do talk about it. Let's read some texts. So what are some of the fruits in the Bible that we can use to identify God's people? What's God's will that people should be doing, that we could point to and say, oh yeah, well, those people are doing that? What are some of the things that people are doing that claim to be God's people that they're not supposed to be doing, but they're doing it anyway? That would be significant, right? Well, let's take a look and find out. Looks like you all can read here. So, Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 15. Be on the watch for the false prophets that come to you in sheep's covering, but inside they are ravenous wolves. By their fruits you will recognize them. Never do people gather grapes from thorns or figs from thistles, do they? Let's think about that for a minute, right? That's just so simple. Right? By their fruits. Okay. So if I want to know what kind of tree it is, I just go up to it and I can look at it and see what it's producing. I can see it's got apples, and so I know it's an apple tree. right? Is that not basically what it's talking about? Real simple stuff. So there should be indications. Now, in some sense, it's not always clear, but like, look at the Jewish people of Jesus' day, right? Really, it was unquestionable, right? Because remember, as we've talked about, while we're going to look at these fruits and these indicators, it really doesn't matter, does it? Right? Because there really is no God's people protection. Were the Jews protected if they individually failed because they were God's people? No, they were only protected in the sense in which they didn't fail to do what they were supposed to do. Were Christians, even though they were God's people in the first century and had the Holy Spirit, were they protected from false doctrine? Were people doing things that were wrong? No way, right? It's all over the place. We just read in Revelation 2 how early Christians had to confront so-called apostles and test them. And Jesus was watching them. And he approved them when they had to do what was hard, right? That would have been tough stuff. People probably close to the apostles or who were using their teachings and using their authority and misleading people. And these faithful early Christians like, wait a minute. We don't care who you are, right? Like Paul. I don't care if it's an apostle or an angel. We're going to put you to the test. Oh, you won't let us put you to the test? You just failed the test. No test equals F. You fail. You are not who you say you are. Done and end of story right there. Anyone who will not let you test them by checking what they say against the accepted sources of information, it's what are we even talking about this for? Because, like we discussed earlier, people don't all care about the truth more than they care about other stuff. So prepare yourselves. It will not matter to some. It might not even matter to you right now or at a time in the past, and eventually it did. It's just the way it is. So we have to be prepared for all kinds of different responses and reactions. It might seem clear to us, right? We can walk up to a tree or to a group and see the fruit and say, okay, I see. Well, not everyone can see so clearly for whatever reason. Usually deception or intention. Likewise, every good tree produces fine fruit, but every rotten tree produces worthless fruit. A good tree cannot bear worthless fruit, neither can a rotten tree produce fine fruit. Every tree not producing fine fruit gets cut down and thrown into the fire. Really then, by their fruits you will recognize them. Not everyone saying to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of the heavens, but the one doing the will of my Father in the heavens will. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, expel demons in your name, and perform many powerful works in your name? I will confess to them, I never knew you. Get away from me, you workers of lawlessness. Therefore, everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does them is likened to a discreet man who built his house upon the rock mass. The rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew and lashed against that house. But it did not cave in, for it had been founded upon the rock mass. Who's the rock mass? Furthermore, everyone hearing these sayings of mine and not doing them will be likened to a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. The rain poured down, and the floods came, and the winds blew and struck against that house, and it caved in, and its collapse was great. Everyone who hears these sayings of mine will be like a house found. Hears these sayings of mine and does them will be like a house founded on a rock. Everyone who hears these sayings of mine and doesn't do them will have a house built on sand. Hear these sayings of mine, does them. House on rock mass. Here's these sayings of mine. I hear you. I understand. No, I'm not going to do it. Sand. Your house is going to go down. It's not going to make it when things get tough. So what is it that we need to do and hear, of course, first? Matthew 12:46, while he was yet speaking to the crowds, look, his mother and brothers took up a position outside, seeking to speak to him. Verse 47, so someone said to him, look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, seeking to speak to you. Verse 48, in answer, Jesus said to the one telling him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And as an answer, he said to the one telling him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And verse 49, extending his hand towards his disciples, he said, look, my mother and my brothers. Verse 54, whoever does the will of my Father who is in the heavens, the same is my brother and my sister and mother. The will of my Father, not the will of anyone else. Just like we read up here, the one doing the will of my Father. Same thing here. John 6:35, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me will not get hungry at all, and he that exercises faith in me will never get thirsty at all. I remember a talk by Fred Franz where he talked about, he applied Isaiah, I believe it was, where it says, hey there, all you thirsty ones, come and drink life's water. Christians don't get thirsty at all. Now, how he ultimately applied that might have some truth to it in some ways, but quite honestly, I would never address Christians as thirsty ones. Because we never get thirsty at all for that stuff. But as I have said to you, verse 36, but I have said to you, you have even seen me, and yet you do not believe. See? It happens all the time. Facts are not always what people will use to decide what they're going to do. Unfortunately, everything the Father gives me will come to me, and the one that comes to me I will by no means drive away. Because I have come down from heaven to do not my will, but the will of him that sent me. This is the will of him that sent me, that I should lose nothing out of all that he has given me, but that I should resurrect it at the last day. For this is the will of my Father. And this is the part that is key that applies to us, of course, right? The first part applies to Jesus, that part of God's will. This part, he says, this is the will of my Father, that everyone that beholds the Son and exercises faith in him should have everlasting life. And I will resurrect him at the last day. That's the Father's will. That's who you completely trust. There's no one else. Not us, not me, not an angel, nobody. Nobody but the Son. Now let's take a look at several explicit do not do this commands, okay? In other words, so we can see here clearly, right, in general, the fruits we would use to determine who's following God, who's God's people, are whoever does the will of the Father. It said that several times, and he explicitly stated that relative to his relatives and non-relatives. And the will of the Father is that we have faith in the Son. And we also know that the Son told us earlier that everyone who does his sayings will be like a house built on rock. And everyone who doesn't do his sayings will be like a house built on sand. Here are some of those sayings. Matthew 24:22. In fact, unless those days were cut short, no flesh would be saved. But on account of the chosen ones, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and give great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the chosen ones. Look, I have forewarned you. Therefore, if people say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Look, he is in the inner chambers, do not believe it. For just as lightning comes out of the eastern parts and shines over to western parts, so the presence of the Son of Man will be. Wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered. Do not believe it. When someone tells you the Christ is somewhere other than what the Bible describes him as being, or that he is in some location other than, again, what the Bible would say, in heaven, on God's throne, at a time, at least from the first century. It explicitly says that in Revelation 1, in Revelation 3, and probably in other texts. In 1 Peter 3:22, it says he went his way to God's right hand, and angels and authorities and powers were made subject to him. Okay, well, that's putting all enemies under his feet. He's ruling as king. He says it explicitly in Revelation 3. So, what else do we need to know? Why is that such a problem? Because it doesn't fit with the chronology and prophecy as understood by the Watchtower. Because it doesn't point to 1914 and to their appointment as this special group of people. But the facts clearly show he was already ruling on God's throne in the first century. He says that to John through his angel. Just as I conquered and sat down on my Father's throne. Okay? That's not at the right hand. That's on the throne. After he conquered, i.e., was killed and resurrected. And in Revelation 1, it refers to him, the one sending them greetings, as presently, at that time, the ruler of the kings of the earth. So there's nothing hard to figure out about it at all. There's nothing in Daniel 4 that even speaks about applying 7 times to anything or anyone but Nebuchadnezzar. And we already know Jesus was ruling on his Father's throne in the first century. He had all authority and power. He didn't need to wait to receive it. He already got it in the first century. There's no later sitting down as king. It's already happened. It's been happening. So while this may not explicitly apply in that way, nonetheless, it clearly states you would visibly see when the kingdom is here, when the presence, right? There'd be no doubt, in other words, everybody. You'd see it like lightning shining from one part of the heaven. It strikes in one part, but you can see it all the way across from the other. That's what he's talking about right here. You want to know where the body is? Well, where are the eagles? It's right there. In other words, there's nothing mysterious about it. It's obvious. That's what it's going to be. That's not what's been happening. No, nobody would even agree, right? Only the Watchtower people believe that. So it doesn't say only Christians would see this. It says everybody, right? In Revelation, all the tribes of the earth would beat themselves in lamentation when they see him. Exactly like it says right here. And of course, Watchtower can apply that in different ways, right? But remember, a lot of what the Watchtower applies is really unusual, right? And I'm not talking about a lot of older stuff, right? There's a lot of, well, of course, we have to contextualize it, right, and be fair. But even currently, right, like look at the trumpet blasts. I talk about the trumpet blasts a little bit in my 3 dissertations. But do you really still believe, Watchtower people, that the trumpet blasts of Revelation are those old, like, declarations, convention declarations and convention type stuff? I don't think so, right? I mean, do you think anybody is going to remember or even remembers any of those things but you, and barely at all, and only upon looking at really old pictures? Nobody thinks of any of that in any way significant at all. And yet in Revelation, the trumpets that are blown, I mean, they're incredibly significant. So, we're not going to get into all kinds of stuff, and I'm not trying to make light of it, Watchtower, but let's be honest, okay? People are not buying this stuff anymore. It might have been a little more believable back right when it was happening, right? Because it's like in the midst of it all, and there are a lot of people doing the same thing, and you seem like you're special and unique, but yeah, that's not really supposed to be looking at yourselves quite like that in these special, massive fulfillments as these really comparatively small and pretty insignificant by now events. So there's a lot of things that really need to be looked at, not just 1914. Almost all of it really is hard to believe. Mark 13, verse 20. In fact, unless Jehovah's similar account had cut short the days, no flesh would be saved. All right. We kind of already read that, so I'll skip past that since we spent some time earlier. Very similar in Luke, right? Days of the Son of Man, people will say, see there, don't go after them. Just as lightning flashes, so the Son of Man will be. Luke 21, then they questioned him, saying, Teacher, when will these things actually be? And what will be the sign of when these things are destined to occur? Verse 8, Jesus said, Look out that you are not misled. For many will come on the basis of my name, saying, I am he, or I am the Messiah, right? Like in the parallel account of Matthew. And the due time has approached. Look at that again. Look out that you are not misled, right? Okay, so this is Jesus the Messiah telling people, you have to be careful here. You have to watch out right here. This is something that could get you. Don't be misled. People are going to come around saying they're me, right? They're saying I am he and this. And if you want to look at them together in some sense, they really both do apply to the society. Right? The society regularly replaces the Messiah with itself. They call themselves the truth, when Jesus in John 14 is the truth. We all know that, right? That's so incredibly inappropriate, at the least, to refer to yourselves, to anyone, as the truth, especially when you clearly change things all the time. It doesn't even make sense as a label for anyone other than Jesus, right? For you guys, I mean, right? Because you change more than most people. So it's kind of weird that you would take that as a name, the truth. Now or then? What do you mean? It was kind of like old light. It doesn't work that way. It's either true or false in terms of correct or incorrect. Right? And something is not, if it's incorrect, then it's not true. If it's true, then it's not incorrect. Right? It's not still true after you've replaced it with something you claim is true. It's no longer true because you no longer believe it's true. It's old truth. It doesn't even make right. Saying something's old truth, old light, as I said earlier, makes no sense. Just like calling yourselves the great crowd makes no sense. It's gaslighting. It's telling you something that's not true just so you believe it. Okay? And he's saying right here, and okay, so they replace themselves by saying they're the truth. Jesus is the truth. And they all the time say, where else are you going to go? Right? And this is another thing, right, Watchtower? You guys make it so difficult for people to leave your group or to find something else because you so frequently make people think that if it's not you, who is it? Right? It's nobody there. Then it's just over. Right? We just quit. And that's really a big danger. That's a real unfortunate danger for you guys. That's why I often say we got to be careful because, for many of you, if the Watchtower Society is not God's chosen channel, if they're not who they think they are, you'll just quit. Right? A lot of you will stay just for the social stuff. We already talked about it. We know that's true. A lot of you who really care and really, really believe that Watchtower is who they say they are and all these things are happening in accordance with what they say is taking place. If that's not true, you wouldn't even believe. You would just quit everything, right? You'd give up on, because if it's not them, who is it? It's Jesus. Is that okay? Is that enough for you? Yeah, you may not have the big socially acceptable group all the time or even ever. Is Jesus okay for you? I thought that was the whole point you were here in the first place. To follow the Christ, to be saved, to do what's right, to worship the Father in spirit and truth. You thought that was going to be easy? You thought everything was going to go perfectly and you'd have all these wonderful things all the time as well? Socially, everyone would love you? So, since we know that's not true, we need to be prepared to do what's right. And if we're not, then we need to be honest with ourselves that we don't really care about the truth. We want to believe we have the truth. We call ourselves the truth, but we really just like being where we are. And you don't want to be bothered with other things. Don't tell me about 1914. Let's not try to question. I just want to believe that I'm in the right place and everything's perfect. No, I'm sorry. It's not going to work that way. It never was. It never will. And it doesn't have to. It can actually be much better by just being real and not being perfect, by being who you are, by making a choice to do everything you can, whatever it is, wherever you are, to support the truth, what's factual about God and the Christ. When someone tries to tell you there's nowhere else to go to, you tell them, you know what? I've got a job, I've got a home, and I've got a life. And the only place or person I need to go to other than those things is the Christ. It says that in the Bible. To whom else shall we go? You, said Peter, Lord, have the sayings of everlasting life. To whom else? Watchtower people, you know this. Watchtower knows this. They're not stupid. They know Jesus is the truth. They're not stupid. They know they're calling themselves Jesus' titles. They're not stupid. They know they're supplanting him with them when it comes to people making decisions about whether they're going to support them or not. Do you think the governing body would say, well, look, you don't have to belong with us as long as you follow the Christ and do the will of the Father. If you don't think we're doing it, go do what you need to do and you'll be fine. As long as you believe it's God's will and you can show by text, we're doing the same thing, and if we don't agree, then so be it. No, of course not. If they don't believe what the Watchtower teaches on all these special issues, right? It's not just the clear stuff. It's not just one God the Father. It's not just Jesus the Messiah. It's not just Golden Rule. It's all this stuff. It's 1914. It's Great Crowd. All of it. Things we can't prove. Things we can show are not true. Things even you don't believe are true. Right? You don't even believe the tribulation has happened. So how could you be the Great Crowd yet? I still don't know who you guys are in the majority. I didn't even know who I was until when I thought about it. Then I realized and I found out. I'm just a Christian, someone trying to do the best I can, who's doing the will of the Father, who's acknowledging my mistakes, and who's relying and trusting in God and His Son. That's it. I'm not going to follow people who tell me they're the truth. I'm not going to follow people who tell me there's nowhere else to go, when I know there's someone else to whom I should go or be with. If it's a choice between him and a group of people who won't listen, don't want to stop writing about things you're not even supposed to be writing about, and who are forcing people to believe things about dates and identities, Great Crowd, 1914, have nothing to do with anything explicit or even indirectly referred to in the Bible relative to Daniel 4 that would give you a basis upon which to say there's more than applying 7 times to Nebuchadnezzar. So these things are being used without any explicit or even implicit evidence in many cases as a measuring stick for whether or not we're acceptable. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't fit with what the Bible talks about. And these same people are telling us over and over again that the end is near, the due time is approached. What does Jesus say? Okay, this is an explicit command. This is a do not. So this would show who's listening, who's discreet. Are you faithful and discreet? Many people in the Watchtower? Okay. Then why do you keep talking about the due time approaching? Why do you keep supplanting the Messiah with yourselves? Because those two things that you do, he says, we're not supposed to go after you. So how could I be held accountable and punished by telling the Messiah, hey, look, Master, I saw these people and they were doing a lot of good things. But then I realized they were teaching things that were not true, including saying basically they were you by supplanting you as the truth and you as the only place the person to whom we should go. And they kept talking about the end times. They kept saying the due time is approached. This is the end of this last day of the last day of the last day stuff. Like it's going to happen anytime. It's imminent. All the time. Nonstop. For over 100 years. Yeah. Yeah, they were basically equating themselves with you and also constantly talking about the incoming. Right. I didn't go after them. No, because you said in Luke 21:8, I remembered that text. You said they were going to come on my name and say basically that they're you, and also that the end is coming, end's approach, due time is here. I remembered what you said, and you said explicitly, right? I was like, no doubt in my mind about what you wanted me to do. Do not go after them. I remembered, no confusion. And as hard as it was, I had to lose friends and family and people I had known for a long time. And I was defending those people for a long time because a lot of stuff was right. And I didn't really see all the ultimate details that really were deal breakers for me for a while. So, I was doing all that. And then I finally said, no, this is explicit. Master said no, and you guys won't stop it. And I have to keep going. Is that good? That was good? Okay, good. I knew it would be good because you said it was, and I was pretty confident. I didn't have any reason to doubt. Yeah, it was explicit. And as I tell people on my videos all the time, if it's not explicit, dismiss it, right? It's a good one. All right. Other explicit biblical do not commands, right? Non-Jesus, but in the Bible, do not do this type stuff, right? Do not go after them. It's right there, everyone. Not easy, though, I know, because again, facts aren't always the most important thing. And we need to remember that so we don't get frustrated. Psalm 146:1. Praise Jah, you people. Praise Jehovah, O my soul. Verse 2, I will praise Jehovah during my lifetime. I'll make melody to my God as long as I am. Do not put your trust in nobles, nor in the son of earthling man to whom no salvation belongs. There's those words again, right? These are do not. No, 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 no. Right? It's like a no, no. No. 9 times no is definitely no, right? Because it's not 0. Whatever it is times itself is still that thing. Well, I guess not necessarily. It's ones and zeros. So never mind that. I think no times no is definitely still no. So I'm going to go with no. Do not put your trust in nobles, nor in the son of earthling man. Okay, so that's 2. Whether you're a noble or whether you're a son of earthling man. Right? Basically, if you're a human, specifically male, but I think we can include females here as well. His spirit goes out, he goes back to his ground, that day his thoughts perish. Happy is the one who has the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in Jehovah his God, the maker of heaven and earth, of the sea, and of all that is in them, the one keeping trueness to time indefinite, the one executing judgment for defrauded ones, the one giving bread to the hungry ones. Jehovah is releasing those who are bound. Jehovah is opening the eyes of the blind. Jehovah is raising up the bowed down. Jehovah is loving the righteous ones. Jehovah is guarding the alien residents, the fatherless boy and the widow he relieves, but the way of the wicked he makes crooked. That's our God right there, right? I mean, why would we ever trust anyone but him or anyone who doesn't act exactly like him? Especially after in the same text that tells us to do that, we're told to not. Watchtower people, of all the things we've talked about or could have talked about to answer the question of whether you're God's people, whether the society is a false prophet or a false teacher, in my own opinion, the most serious, and there's a lot of contenders, but at this time, I just can't shake the significance of Lotius' comments to completely trust the faithful slave. The people who call themselves that, right? The same people that call the great crowd, who's not here yet, according to the beliefs of the very same people who call them the great crowd. It's funny. I'm sorry, Watchtower people. It is. It's not like I'm not laughing at you or anything. It's kind of crazy funny. It's driving me. Maybe all that just is why sometimes I. Maybe it has made me a little nuts. No, I don't think so because I see pretty clearly. But it makes me feel like it's just a crazy issue. It seems kind of nuts to me now when we talk about some of these things and we're asking a question about who we should trust. And you're asking, and we're actually talking about, we're discussing seriously whether or not, as Christians who worship the biblical God and follow the biblical Messiah, we're actually entertaining this question of whether or not we should have complete trust, let alone whether or not God and Jesus have complete trust in any human. When we already read how Paul told us not to completely trust any human or angel who tells us something different than what they taught. And we already read where Jesus commended the first century Christians who absolutely did not trust the ones who claimed to be apostles. Where's there a problem anywhere in the Bible with not completely trusting any human being? So again, we're getting teachings from the group that says they're the channel for God's people. We're getting teachings that are directly against explicit teachings of the text. And we're getting teachings that don't have any support from the text. Okay, you guys use God's name. That's great. People have been using God's name. You've been using it more than many people. We give you credit for that. You've also associated the divine name with teachings that are false, more than many other groups have. So you get credit taken away from you for that. You start to look more like the Jews when you do that. The Jews that had God's name more than anybody else were a people for his name, but who by and large proved false to it and were rejected. So even if we grant that you are in some sense in the same way God's people, that does not protect you from being rejected. In fact, it makes you more likely to be rejected if you teach what is false. Because the Father don't put up with that. Neither does the Son. We've shown that. And we're told not to trust anyone, any human. So, you got some things, right? You also have other aspects of your organization that I would give you credit for. Things that you've done that show an evangelistic spirit. Things that would show a lack of desire to be a part of the world. Although, I think in many ways you could look at different things in some respects in terms of going too far when it comes to the world, right? Where as you guys make requirements and rules for people that they have to follow or be shunned as apostates from God if they celebrate days, months, or seasons without any idea of paganism in their minds or as part of what they're doing. You don't have authority for that. The Bible clearly states, as we're going to read in a little bit, you're not supposed to be judging people over that stuff. And you guys are judging people with total finality, right? It's like, if you do this, you are done, right? You're in Gehenna. You're apostate, Armageddon, material, right? You guys judge with such finality toward everybody. It's quite incredible when you look at some of the things you've done or that you don't do. It makes it hard to talk to a lot of you sometimes because of the categorical nature of how you see things, black or white, pretty much. And that kind of thinking can be very dangerous unless the things you're using as a standard or measure are limited and explicit. And in your case, they're all over the place. It's everything. It's all this stuff at any time, no matter whether it changes or not. And that just isn't what we read in the Bible about anyone that we're supposed to trust, let alone completely. Micah 7, starting verse 1. Too bad for me, for I have become like the gatherings of summer fruit, like the gleanings of grape gathering. There's no grape cluster to eat, no early fig that my soul would desire. The loyal one has perished from the earth, and among mankind there's no upright one. All of them for bloodshed they lie in wait. They hunt, everyone his own brother with a dragnet. Their hands are upon what is bad to do it well. The prince is asking, the one who is judging, does so for the reward. The great one is speaking forth for the craving of his soul, his very own, and they interweave it. Their best one is like a briar. Their most upright one is worse than a thorn hedge. The day of your watchman, of your being given attention, must come. Now will occur the confounding of them. Do not put your faith in a companion. Do not put your trust in a confidential friend. From her who is lying in your bosom, guard the openings of your mouth. For a son is despising a father, a daughter is rising up against a mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own household. And I have to compare here, we won't read it right now, but Matthew 10, where Jesus basically says the same thing, right? I referred to it earlier when we were talking about how people value things like association socially with friends and family more than facts, the truth. And they do. A lot of people, not everyone. But look at what Jesus says right here. He says, after saying what we just read in Micah, he says in verse 37, he that has greater affection for father or mother than for me is not worthy of me. He that has greater affection for son or daughter than for me is not worthy of me. Why is that? Don't we love our fathers, our mothers, our sons, our daughters? What's going on here, right? Is this like anti-family stuff? No. He's showing you can't trust anyone, right? Micah was talking about how you got to watch the sayings of your mouth with the person who's lying next to you in bed. We're all sinful, everyone. We're not supposed to be trusting ourselves or anybody completely, for sure. And even if it comes to our own family, what is the teaching? Do we want that? Of course not. You should do everything possible, to make sure you keep your family intact, that you stay close to your family. But if your family tells you to completely trust a group of people that you're not supposed to completely trust, who keep talking about the end coming, the due time being near, and replacing the Messiah with themselves, well, who do you love more? What do you love more? Do you love God, Messiah, the truth, or your family? It's a tough one. We all love our family. But the only reason we have our family is because of God and the Messiah. And if the only way we can have association with our family is by compromising the truth, are we sure we're valuing that association correctly? Are we sure that's worth the sacrifice for what is right? If it is, then so be it. You get to choose. 1 John 3:17, we're getting near the end, everyone. But whoever has this world's means of supporting life and beholds his brother having need and yet shuts the door of his tender compassions, in what way does the love of God remain in him? Little children, let us love, neither in word nor with the tongue, but in deed and truth. By this we shall know we originate with the truth, and we shall assure our hearts before him, as regards whatever our hearts may condemn us in, because God is greater than our hearts and knows all things. Beloved ones, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have freeness of speech toward God. Whatever we ask from him, because we're observing his commandments and are doing the things that are pleasing in his eyes, indeed, this is his commandment, that we have faith in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and be loving one another. Right? 2 of our 3 things right there. This is God's commandment, that we have faith in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and be loving one another. It does not say anything about having to completely trust anyone else. Moreover, he who observes his commandments remains in him, and he in such one. And by this we gain the knowledge that we remain in union. He remains in union with us, owing to the Spirit he gave us. Beloved ones, do not believe every inspired expression. Test the inspired expressions to see whether they originate with God. Again, testing. How are you going to do that? If they won't let you test them, if you can't go to them like the Christians did in Ephesus in Revelation 2 and say, well, wait a minute here. Where are you getting that 7 times in Daniel 4 apply to anything other than Nebuchadnezzar? Can you just show me where you're getting that? Where is it that justifies doing that? Or that in any way indicates that that should be done? It doesn't. You just made it up and interpreted in light of world conditions like the World War I, and you just figured you would apply 7 times and equate that to 2,520 years, a day for a year, having nothing to do with Daniel 4, but doing it anyway and choosing 607 related to Zedekiah being removed as a vassal king for the Jews or Judah. When it talks about Nebuchadnezzar, again, there's nothing. So, if we can't test stuff like this, everyone, if we can't go to these people and ask them for their evidence and it be explicitly provided to us, the game's over right there. Right? You need to immediately start preparing to either stand up for the truth and get out of there, or just be honest with yourself. You like the association, you love your family in a way that is not going to allow you to put the facts, the truth, ahead of them or ahead of what you are getting socially in terms of your being a part of the organization. Just to be honest with yourself and stop bothering us about things. Stop trying to get us to follow people that we can see won't even let us test them, right? We don't have the option. It's not something they permit. And yet it's something we have to be able to do. We can't do that. It's over. Second, someone won't let you test them according to the evidence that they have to support their teaching, and it be provided to you and it show explicitly that that's what it teaches. You're done. Leave or start admitting that the truth is not as important to you as these other things. It's one or the other, right, in this case. The truth is going to motivate you, or there could be some, I guess, middle reaction where you're working towards something, but basically it's going to have to affect you, or you're going to have to just ignore it. Let's take a look at love, right? Love among yourselves, right? By all this, I'm giving you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also love one another. All this, by this, all will know you are my disciples, God's people. You have love among yourselves, right? And Watchtower people, you guys use this a lot relative to like not going to war and stuff like that. And that is I think, acceptable. I think that's a good mark in your favor, that you have that kind of neutrality, that definitely you can say, hey, we have love among ourselves in a way that we know we're not killing each other. That's great. That should be acknowledged. But that's not the end of the story. That does not prove you have. There are a lot other groups that don't go to war. There are other people that don't do that. Now you might say, well, it's part of a collective list of things that uniquely identifies. Okay, but again, there are some things that clearly point away from you, things that you do that you're not supposed to do, like constantly telling people the end is drawn near, or substituting the Christ for yourselves. So those are big ones, right? And just because you're using the divine name or you have the right view of God theologically, well, that's no different from the Jews of Jesus' day, who were nonetheless rejected because they were still teaching false doctrine in spite of having those true doctrines. And they were requiring things of people the Bible didn't require. They were going way too far, like you often do and have done on many issues. Right? If people don't go to all your meetings or out in field service for a certain number of hours, They're looked down upon as weak, right? I mean, there's nothing in the Bible that in any way supports that kind of stuff. Where you say, well, we need to keep track of the ministry. Oh, do you really? Don't you have faith that's being done? The disciples have to keep track of how many hours they put in? There's nothing in the Bible that shows that. It seems like they had faith the work was getting done. Maybe you should just have faith. Maybe you should just go out and not look at numbers, because numbers don't really tell you the story, right? How many people did you talk to? Why don't you keep track of that? That's really the only stat that matters. How many people did I talk to today? Why don't you turn that in? And then you can keep track of how many people have been reached. But instead, it's how much time you spent, right? That doesn't make any sense. That's something that's used as a means of control almost, of comparison. And judgment, basically. When it's really not what's most important at all. The number of people you talk to is. All right, so let's talk more about this love. 1 John 4:12, at no time has anyone beheld God. Sorry, Trinitarians. If we continue loving one another, God remains in us, and his love is made perfect in us. By this we gain the knowledge that we are remaining in union with him, and he in or in union with us, because he has imparted his Spirit to us. In addition, we ourselves have beheld and we're bearing witness that the Father sent forth his Son as Savior of the world. Whoever makes the confession that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, God remains in union with such a one, and he in union with God. We ourselves have come to know and have believed that the love that God has in our case, God is love. And he that remains in love remains in union with God, and God in him. This is how love has been made perfect in us, that we have freeness of speech in the day of judgment, because just as that one is, so are we ourselves in the world. Verse 18, there is no fear in love. Perfect love throws fear outside, because fear exercises a restraint. Indeed, he that is under fear has not been made perfect in love. Watchtower people, if love is the identifying mark for you because you have it among yourselves, why are you guys so afraid to talk about issues with your doctrine? And don't give me this, you remember who you're talking to, okay? I actually know what I'm talking about in these ways. And we all know you cannot bring up these issues and question with facts teachings of the Watchtower like 1914 or the Great Crowd. Two of the easiest ones to show they don't have any evidence for. But if you do that, if you try to tell anyone in the organization they're not the Great Crowd, because the Great Crowd's not here yet, you're done, right? You will be removed. You will be silenced. You will have fear. And even if you don't have fear, the other ones will, and they won't say anything. So I'm not so sure you have this perfect love that would have to be kind of what we're talking about, right? Because it's John talking about what he recorded Jesus is talking about. There's just a lot of fear in the Watchtower. You guys can't question anything. You can't do what the Christians in Ephesus did. No, you can't. You'll be thrown out of the organ. It's too controlling. They're too locked tight. They're not going to allow people to question them openly at all. So there's a problem there. And you can't put them to the test, obviously, right? Here he goes on to say that this is what the love of God means. We observe his commandments, and yet his commandments are not burdensome. Well, Watchtower people, you guys have so many commandments and things that are required. How can you not say that you're burdening people? I mean, you're adding so many requirements for people to be approved in association with you. I don't see how you could say it's not burdensome, or that all of the extra things that you require are what God requires. Well, because you think he appointed you. again, even if that's true, that doesn't make you immune to false teaching. The Jews and the Christians show this clearly during times when we all agree they were chosen and being used by God. So the fact is, we have to be careful that people don't make more requirements for us than are necessary. And if God doesn't command it in the Bible, it's not a requirement. I'm sorry. No, I don't have to turn in time. No, I don't have to go door to door if I want to do some other form of ministry work. No, I don't have to believe that the trumpet blasts of Revelation are your conventions or your convention declarations or publications related to your organization that no one even remembers, or even read or cares about, and that aren't even really what you believe in terms of some of the content. 2 John 1:5. Now I request you, lady, as a person writing to you, not a new commandment, but one which we had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is what love means, that we go on walking according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, that you should go on walking in it. For many deceivers have gone forth in the world, persons not confessing Jesus is coming in the flesh. This is the Antichrist. Look out for yourselves, that you don't lose the things you work so hard to produce, that you get a full reward. Everyone that pushes ahead and does not remain in the teaching of the Christ does not have God. He that does remain in this teaching is the one that has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, never receive him into your homes or say a greeting to him. Now, Watchtower people, you guys use this often for apostates, people who don't believe in the governing body or its teachings about things like 1914, great crowd, and some other stuff, blood issue. But yet, clearly, right, it's talking about what's not a new command, that you love one another, and that we have to profess Jesus as coming in the flesh, and that the not remaining in the teaching of the Christ does not have God. And if you don't bring this teaching, that the teaching of the Christ, that not remaining in the teaching of the Christ doesn't have God, and that he that remains in the teaching has both the Father and the Son, anyone who comes to you that doesn't bring this teaching right here, you don't say a greeting or receive them into your homes. Now, you apply this to all kinds of stuff, like 1914 stuff. And yet, Watchtower people, you ready for this? This isn't even written to you, unless you're anointed, right? This doesn't even apply to members of the great crowd. Not according to you. And it's actually true, right? Because the great crowd's really not Christians. But you think they are, right? You think it's a different class of Christians. So this wouldn't really apply to you, right? Just like when Paul talks about being sons of God, none of that applies to you. Because all the New Testament documents are written by and for members of the anointed. The letters, in any case. So, why do you apply this to members of the great crowd that turn against your teachings? Right? If someone's not anointed and they don't bring the teachings of your organization, well, this doesn't apply. This is written to anointed people. So why would you ever apply this to any member of the great crowd that chooses not to believe your doctrine? And of course, I would argue that you shouldn't apply this to anyone who doesn't bring the Christ teaching. Not your teaching, not your, right? The teaching of the Christ. Once again, we could say this is the society supplanting the Christ. Because they say, if you don't bring their teaching, right, about all kinds of unusual stuff, then you're out. You're not even to be received in anyone's home or say a greeting. It clearly doesn't apply in that way. And according to you, it wouldn't even apply to the majority of people in your organization anyway. So, Dada. You guys hear Dada going nuts back there? Okay, just a few more texts here, people. James 1:16, do not be misled, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and perfect present is from above, comes from the Father. With him there's not a variation of the turning of a shadow. There's no old light, everybody. It's just light. Or not light. There's old light is like old truth. Right? Because truth is light. But truth is never old. It's just true all the time. Sorry, you're being gaslit. I know it's hard. But they know what they're doing. Yes, they do. They're not stupid. Not this stupid. Old light. Think about that. Makes no sense. And it's only designed to cover over false doctrine. To make false doctrine seem like it's no big deal. But it is a big deal. Especially when you're claiming that it's God's promise, right? And that you've been directly appointed as his unique channel to explain all this stuff. 1 John 2:26, these things I write to you about those who are trying to mislead you. And as for you, the anointing you received from him remains in you, and you do not need anyone to be teaching you. But as the anointing from him is teaching you about all things, and is true and is no lie, just as it is taught you, remain in union with him. See, Watchtower people, you don't need anyone to be teaching you. You do because you don't claim to be anointed or really even Christians in the truest sense. You claim to be Christians, though, because you split it up in some way that can't be justified using the text. But if you just understood that we're all Christians, you would realize you don't need a governing body. They only went to the group of people in Jerusalem who were prominent and looked up to at the time that they did in Acts because it made sense to do so based on the cultural clashings that were going on between the Jews and Gentiles in association with the law and the freedom they now had in Christ. That sounds totally right. That seems like something people would do today if we had a similar issue. Come to all the people who are responsible and prominent, find out how to handle it, and then move forward. That never happens again. And Paul even openly rejects it happening again, at least with him. Saw no value in it, went there, and then left, started doing his own thing. Never talks about having to get authority from them. Openly confronts and condemns people like Peter and others. Jesus never mentions anyone in Revelation that you have to listen to. And he even approves the people he's talking to for questioning those who do the exact same thing Watchtower does. So it's really a question again of what do you really value, right? Do you value what's true? Do you value what the accounts actually explicitly tell us? Or are you just too comfortable? Are you going through the very thing that you say other groups like Catholics and others are doing? They don't really care. They're just raised in it. Their family, their friends. Could be. Very powerful. He that does not love mother, he that has more love for mother, father, sister, or brother than Jesus. Yeah. So that's all in the text. You knew that, right? You read that text? You never read that before? It's in there. We just read it. So what are you going to do now? Right? Does that fact matter? It's pretty explicit. No dancing around it, right? If you find there's a problem between what Jesus says to do and what your parents say to do, or your family says to do, or your friends say to do, what are you going to do? Who are you going to trust? I think you know the answer. 1 Thessalonians 4:9, however, with reference to brotherly love, you don't need us to be writing to you. Kind of like with what he says about the end times, right? Because you yourselves are taught by God to love one another. Right? We don't need all this literature, everybody. We don't need to be constantly reminding everyone with publication after document after letter after magazine. We don't need a group to publish all this stuff. We don't need a centralized business authority, corporate structure with all kinds of money. We need them out there working with their hands like Paul and the others did. Not being a burden to anyone. Not lying. Not putting yourself above being tested. Not requiring doctrinal beliefs that have no basis or evidence in the text. Not doing the things or doing the things that you're not supposed to do, I should say. Right? Telling everyone the end is drawn near. You're not supposed to do that. And in fact, it says so right here. As for times and seasons, brothers, you need nothing. Nothing. You need nothing. So how could it be food at the proper time? You don't need it. You need food. You don't need this. Because you already know. You yourselves know quite well Jehovah's Day, the Lord's Day. It's coming as a thief in the night. Why do you need to know more than that, Watchtower people? Why can't you just be ready all the time? Why do you have to constantly be telling everybody that the end is coming? That the ancient worthies are going to be resurrected and be living in houses in 1925? Why do you have to tell everybody? Get everyone excited about 1975. Why do you have to tell everybody that the generation that saw the events of 1914 isn't going to pass away until the end comes? You don't have to, right? None of it was necessary ever. And it's all wrong, right? It's not only not necessary, you got it wrong, okay? You forced people to believe things that were clearly not true in God's name, and you punished them, and you broke up families, and you kicked people out, and you apostatized everybody. All because they wouldn't accept your views of 1914 and Daniel 4. Right? You guys really just destroyed a lot of well-meaning people who just couldn't understand what you're doing. What are you doing? Why are you doing all this stuff when it tells us you're not supposed to be doing any of it? Right? I mean, it's so crazy. I'm not even, it's like, is this really happening? Right? Are we really going through this? I don't know. Maybe we aren't. Maybe it's all a simulation. Romans 14. Welcome the man having weaknesses in his faith, but not to make decisions on inward questionings. Watchtower people, can you stop making decisions for our people? Can we make some decisions on our own? Can I decide if I want to go to all of your meetings? Can I decide if I want to report my time? Can I decide if I want to celebrate something that isn't openly and for intentional reasons having to do with non-Christian or anti-Christian stuff? Am I allowed to make some decisions? Yes, I am. It says right here, and it says you're not supposed to be. We're not supposed to do that. It's another not. It's not a do not, but it's not. You're not supposed to do that. Even someone weak. Leave them alone. They'll get strong. They'll figure it out. Don't confuse them. Let them just exist and learn and be happy. Believe in God the Father. Follow and accept the Messiah the Son. And treat each other the way we want to be treated. Just leave people alone. Okay? And then let them figure out the rest on their own. That's what we do. It says right here. We're not supposed to do otherwise. One man has faith to eat everything. But the man who is weak eats vegetables, right? This is contextually related to that time. But it's relative to us today in regards to something similar, right? Let the one eating not look down on the one not eating, and let the one not eating not judge the one eating, for God has welcomed that one. Who are you to judge the house servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he'll be made to stand, for the Lord, or in the NWT, Jehovah can make him stand. One man, Romans 14:5, judges one day above another. Another judges one day as all others. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind, Watchtower. What are you doing? Why are you forcing everybody to judge one day as the same as another day? Right? Isn't that what you say? Christmas is just like any other day. Well, no, it's actually not. It's a day people have selected and are using to celebrate something related to the Bible. And whether or not it replaced something that wasn't related to the Bible, the fact is, the majority of people associate it with something in the Bible, things that actually are in the Bible, such as Jesus' birth. Whether it was on this day or that day, we're not told. They've chosen that day. They value that day as above another day. So why don't you leave them alone? Why are you out there bothering everybody with your anti-Christmas magazines? Right? You can't even leave people alone and enjoy one day that's supposed to be honoring the Messiah in their own way. Who cares whether you think it does or not? Did anyone ask you, hey, does this honor the Messiah? I just want to make sure I have your approval. No, we don't need your approval. And you don't need mine. You know what you need? Just to value something. And then choose to value it without violating anything that would be appropriate to the Christ. And you have to be convinced in your own mind. It doesn't say that we run around and start judging you. In fact, it says right here, not to judge, not to look down on the one doing something different in the context of eating and valuing days. Who are you? Who do you think you are? You think you're appointed as a faithful and discreet slave, and yet you can't even stop judging the master's slaves? They're not your slaves. You know what that sounds like, Watchtower people? It sounds like you're beating your fellow slaves. It sounds like you think you're the faithful and discreet slave of the master. The master's not here yet in the way that he would need to be to stop you. And so you keep doing what you're not supposed to do. You keep judging the other slaves. They're not your slaves. Even if you are the faithful and discreet slave, which you couldn't possibly know, because you don't decide that. Even if you are, you're not supposed to be judging the other slaves. They're not yours to judge. And you do it all the time. So right here, once again, you are openly violating what the master says you're not supposed to do, or his servant Paul says you're not supposed to do. And Jesus in the accounts, of course, with the faithful slave, right? You're beating your fellow slaves is what you're doing, Watchtower people, in terms of at least those who would claim that. You're oppressing people. You're making it burdensome for people and having them do all kinds of weird stuff that's nowhere in these texts. For what? For you. It's not benefiting us. It's benefiting you. It's not benefiting the Christ. It's making him look ridiculous. All your false teachings and incorrect predictions about dates and God's promise. And we got to now explain all that to people, that you were just wrong or lying. No, you have to explain that. You know what, Watchtower people, we're done. I'm not doing that again. You go and do it. You go and start telling people why the people you want everyone to submit to are lying all the time, are acting oppressive towards people's valuation of days, getting involved in people's lives, making the ministry burdensome, judging other slaves, and you're not the master. Yet you think you are, don't you, right? They think they've been appointed over everybody. See, they couldn't possibly be. Because right here, this is how you're supposed to act. And of course, the whole account involving the faithful slave is a part of a series of accounts. There are illustrations about what's going to happen when he comes to judge everybody. When he sits down on his throne and gathers everyone before him. So, you have not been appointed over anyone in those ways. The designation of being a faithful and discreet slave hasn't even happened. You've self-designated and elevated yourself above everybody else in the organization, whom you've also designated, and both designations are out of time. They don't apply. The great crowd isn't here, according to your own teaching, and your own teaching about when you were appointed as the faithful slave doesn't have any evidence. All the evidence actually supports the opposite. So, there's really no reason whatsoever to have any fear of you at all. And we don't. We have perfect love. We just read that earlier. Perfect love throws fear out of here. Watchtower people, you're the ones afraid. You're the ones who can't do anything outside of the Watchtower. And again, we acknowledge the Watchtower has some truths. Other groups have some truths. But Watchtower, you also, again, as we've shown here, you openly go directly against what you're told not to do. Whether it's judging other people, constantly talking about the incoming, or supplanting the Christ with yourselves. And you also don't do things that mark Jesus' followers, like taking care of the poor in the world, right? You do things for yourselves. That's not what the Good Samaritan illustration is about. And yeah, as Jesus said, anyone, or as we read in the Bible, anyone can take care of those who are his own. Right? Even the nations do that. It is Jesus who says that. Right? It takes something else to actually reach out to people who you aren't familiar with, who aren't part of your own group, like the Good Samaritan, and help people who need it. And all the churches in Christendom make you guys, Watchtower, look pretty ridiculous. If your use of the divine name makes most churches look ridiculous by comparison, then in terms of charity, in terms of helping the poor, it's pretty close. And you guys don't do anything, right? It's like nothing. Maybe some individuals would do things, but as a group, as an organization, you guys don't do anything. All that money and stuff, right? Instead of buying all this property and all these buildings and paying all these lawsuits, maybe you should be helping the poor. That was the whole reason they gave money to the apostles in the New Testament, so that it could be properly apportioned and people could be looked after properly. Not to enrich yourselves and amass all these millions and billions of dollars worth of property and stuff. Sometimes we need to just take a step back, everyone, and look at the practical side of things. It's often much clearer than we think. We're in our last account here. We're almost done. He who observes the day observes it to Jehovah or the Lord. Also he who eats to Jehovah, for he gives thanks to God. He who does not eat to Jehovah, yet he gives thanks to God. None of us, in fact, lives with regard to himself only, and no one dies with regard to himself only. For both if we live to Jehovah. If we die to Jehovah or the Lord. Right? I don't agree with these uses of the divine name here, but that's not the subject. Therefore, both if we live and if we die, we belong to the Lord or Jehovah. Romans 14:9, for to this end Christ died and came to life again, that he might be Lord over both the dead and the living. Verse 10, but why do you judge your brother? Or why do you look down on your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of God. Romans 14:11, for it is written, as I live, says Jehovah. This is an appropriate use of divine name, quoting the Old Testament. To me every knee will bend down, every tongue will make open acknowledgement to God. Verse 12, so then each of us will render an account for himself to God. Verse 13, therefore let us not be judging one another any longer, but rather make this your decision, not to put before a brother or sister or mother or father or son or daughter. I think that'll be okay to add here, wouldn't you say? A stumbling block or cause for tripping. Not. Now, everybody, we've talked about a lot of things. I mean, it's gone pretty quick, but it's been over 3 hours. But I wanted to go as long as it took to just have a discussion, get into some of these texts, talk about some issues, and just try to come to some understanding if possible. The text we just read, Romans 14:13, not to be judging anyone any longer, and to make it our decision not to put before people a stumbling block or cause for tripping. Watchtower people, if you're God's people, I have to ask not only why you're teaching so many things about prophecy and chronology that are either not true or not what we're supposed to be writing about, let alone requiring from other people. And why you're saying things like the generation that saw the events of 1914 won't pass away, it's God's promise, or that the great crowd is here and it's been here for like 100 years, almost 100 years, when we know it's not. Why put these stumbling blocks before people? Why are we making a cause for tripping? We're told not to write about times and seasons. We just read it. We read it many times. Jesus tells us not to go after those who say the end is drawn near or who claim that they're him. Why are you doing this? Why even get close, right? Why even substitute Jesus' title, the truth, for you? Why say, where else are you going to go when he says to whom else? Why even do that at all, right? Why risk it? Right? Why tell people like Loesch did that God and Jesus completely trust you, when Paul tells us not to completely trust any of them or an angel, and Jesus commends people for not trusting those who claim to be apostles? Why are you doing it? What's the point? What is the goal? I mean, are you just trying to make it harder for everybody? If the Bible tells us not to put our trust in humans, why are you telling us to completely trust you? Exactly. What's the point? What's the goal? What's the advantage? What are you getting from this? That everyone trusts you, right? But the Bible's not benefiting. That doesn't benefit God, the Christ, or the Bible when you contradict it like that and tell us to do something we're not supposed to do just because it benefits you. That's like the reason why we're not supposed to do it. So if the only reason you have to tell us to completely trust you is for your benefit and not ours, well, then we have a problem. And the problem is you. You're doing something wrong. We're not doing something wrong. What? What's wrong about not trusting a human whom the Bible says not to trust? Again, it's like bizarre, huh? Why am I even, what am I talking? Why is this even being discussed? It just seems so, it's like gender stuff, huh? Why are we even talking about it? Or the homo stuff, right? Why don't you see that's abuse? Why are you even talking about it as an alternative lifestyle? You want to do it? Go ahead. But why are you promoting it? What are you talking about? There's an element of weird here I can't understand. I can't figure out there's no benefit to any of us or to God or Jesus when the society says to completely trust them and that God and Jesus completely trust them. There's no benefit to me, you, God, or Jesus when the society says it's God's promise the generation that saw 1914 won't pass away. There's no benefit to me, you, God, or Jesus to say the great crowd has been here for almost 100 years when they're not here. How does that benefit anybody? It's just gaslighting, right? It's just telling them something that's not true. And I guess, what, it makes them like a placebo effect? It makes them like the emperor with no clothes. You're just telling them something for their emotional well-being. And then ultimately, when they find out it's wrong, they're going to collapse because they realize they were lied to the whole time. I can't understand the rationale or the planning that's going into some of these things and why, other than for their own selfish benefit, right? To keep them in power, keep them in control, and managing all these resources and all the authority that they have over all the doctrine. That's it. I can't see any other benefit, right? They're not out earning a separate living on their own. They're paid for as the governing body, right? They're not out doing hard labor and stuff like Paul and others. So clearly they're benefiting and we're not. God and the Christ are not benefiting when the society makes promises in their name that fail or that teach things that are clearly not true, like with the great crowd or generation. None of that. So these are stumbling blocks, are they not? If they're not, well, what is a stumbling block then? If you act like you're God's appointed people, God's people, and you tell someone things that end up not being true, either by the facts of history or you changing the doctrine, well, then can you see where that would stumble people, Watchtower? Why are you being so reckless? You're directly told, don't write about this stuff. You keep doing it. What are we supposed to make of that? You won't stop. You won't listen. Okay? Can you stop writing about the end times? How about for 1 month? Can we get you for 1 month? Well, that'd be kind of, I guess maybe. How about for 2 months? Could we imagine the Watchtower for 2 months not writing anything about times and seasons? I don't think so. And yet it's an explicit statement in the Bible that it's never to be. You don't need nothing. Right? Maybe you get a reminder here or there, thief in the night. It's nonstop, everybody. Nonstop. God's promise before generation passes. Nonstop. Now it's overlapping. Doesn't even make sense. So I'm not seeing any benefits for anybody but the governing body and those running the Watchtower. And it's very clear they are benefiting from it. You're not benefiting from it. The only benefit you will get from it at this point is some basic introduction to what the Bible teaches. You will get the benefit of not having full exposure to a lot of false Trinitarian doctrine that tends to come with a lot of the mistranslations in their Bibles. That's good. You'll get more familiarity with the divine name. That's good. But you're going to do so believing that you can only do so with these people because they don't believe you can do so anywhere else. And so it's a full package. You have to accept it all, and you have to shut your mouth when they put stumbling blocks in front of people and they recklessly do things like write about times and seasons or claim titles of the Messiah. And people wonder and say, well, it says there we're not supposed to go after you, and you're stumbling me there. I'm going to leave. You're going to have to accept all that. You're going to have to accept people in the ministry telling you, I like some of the things you do, but some of the things you've done are not acceptable. The Bible explicitly tells us not to trust humans. You want me to completely trust your leaders. The Bible tells us we don't need anything to be written about times and seasons. And that's really all you guys write about. You guys keep saying that most of your members are part of this great crowd that shouldn't partake of the emblems. But the great crowd doesn't even appear until after the tribulation that you yourselves don't believe has happened. See, you get put in positions not by the Bible, not by God, not by Jesus, by the Watchtower. Yeah, and other groups do it too. The Mormons do the same thing. A lot of Catholics do the same thing. Many evangelicals. Their traditions. We all have to deal with it, with everybody. We're talking about Watchtower right now, though. So fortunately, Watchtower people who are still, tied in some way, and it's not easy. That's why Jesus said that. That's why he told you, it's going to be tough. But you're not in a prison, are you? You're not being tortured, are you? It could be a lot worse than just having to make decisions over truth and relationships. Maybe we should be thankful for that. But whatever the case, it's my hope that whether Watchtower is God's people, that people will look at Watchtower and use the same means of evaluating them that God's people are given in the Old and New Testaments. And if that's done, it really won't matter whether or not the Watchtower is God's people, because then you'll be able to do the things that God's people not only did, but are told that we are supposed to do. And if we can't do that, then I don't think we're going to be God's people. And if the people who say they're God's people won't let us test them and find out using the facts and what the Bible explicitly teaches, then I don't see any reason why we should consider any people or group who refuses to be subject to the same testing that Jesus approved in Revelation 2 could be God's people.